LoveLore Library. Chapter 153. If you shut your mouth, no one here will treat you as a mute. Yu looked at Anda and uttered a famous Federation proverb. His calm gaze startled Anda. He scratched his head and obediently shut his mouth. Since you are a student of Yue University, you must be studying under Professor Zhou, said Yu as he turned around and smiled at Su Lu. For some reason, Su Lu felt that the other party's gaze on him was a little strange. He had always thought that his face was very ordinary, but who would have thought that the other party would be able to recognize him just from his voice? After a few words, although Su Lu was not familiar with this A student of the First Military Academy, he had gained a deeper understanding of him. He thought to himself that this person was able to obtain such respect and status among so many proud military students of First Military Academy. It seemed that it was not only because of his excellence, but also because of the aura he exuded through his speech and actions. At this time, all the examinees had already entered the meeting room. They were either nervous or calm as they waited for the final assessment results. Just like in the cafeteria, the 100 or so examinees were still divided into 3 groups according to the 3 major military academies. And because Su Lu was talking to Yu, he just happened to be sitting in the middle of this group of students from First Military Academy. The blonde examinee sitting in the first row is Park Ji-ho from the 3rd Military Academy. I heard that he flew over from District S3 a month in advance for the Shell Motor Company's spring recruitment. I wonder how he did today. Under the strange gazes of the surrounding students, Yu calmly introduced the examinee to Su Lu. He was indeed very interested in Su Lu. On one hand, it was because he had guessed that the other was that fellow with the strange mecha piloting ability. On the other hand, before he had left the school, the staff of the Xiao Shu Foundation who had sponsored his studies for 4.5 years had once asked him about the abilities of the black mecha operator from Yue University. In other words, Yu now knew that this auditing student who had once been a trooper had long since entered the sights of the Tai family management. He really wanted to try and get in touch with this kind of person. Park Ji-ho. Su Lu naturally did not know what Yu was thinking, so he replied casually. He's the ace student of the mechanical department of the 3rd campus. Last year, during the Tri-College Exchange Conference, he once fought against me in the mecha combat room. In the end, the professors determined that it was a draw. When the topic of mecha combat was brought up, Yu looked at Su Lu with a hint of a smile in his eyes. Su Lu was slightly surprised, and his gaze turned towards the golden-haired candidate in the front row. Although he had not had much interest in mecha combat, his training in Area H1 had made him no stranger to mecha combat. In that mecha battle, he had fought to a draw with Yu beside him, but he knew very well that if not for that antique simulation system, if not for the mysterious power within his body, and if not for his excellent luck at that moment, he definitely would not have been able to hold on under the ferocious attacks of Yu's silver mecha. For that Park Ji-ho to be able to fight to a draw with Yu, he must also be quite a powerful character. Park Ji-ho is proud and arrogant, and is completely unwilling to admit that it was a draw. This morning, he already made an appointment with me. After entering the company, we will have a real mecha battle on the testing grounds. Yu looked at Su Lu, and asked seriously, "Are you interested?" Hearing the first half of the sentence, Su Lu sighed internally. These outstanding students of the 3 major military academies were indeed full of confidence and pride. It looked like they had never considered that they would fail the assessment. However, when he heard the last sentence, his heart could not help but tighten. He narrowed his eyes at Yu, and after a long pause, he smiled and said, "I have never even seen a real mecha in my life." Yu saw that Ling Lan was unwilling to respond to his probing, but he was not in a hurry. After a moment of silence, he asked directly, "The last time I went to Yue University, there was a black mecha." The smile on Su Li's face did not change, but his heart was growing more and more nervous. He did not know how the other party had connected him to that black mecha. Although he had already confirmed that the mysterious trembling power within his body could be perfectly concealed, and that even if someone found out that he was the pilot in that black mecha, there would not be any major problems, he still subconsciously felt somewhat uneasy. Fortunately, Zhou Yu's calm and questioning gaze did not put too much pressure on him and force him to admit anything. Because at that moment, a row of 7 examiners walked into the meeting room. The meeting room instantly fell silent. Sulo let out a silent sigh of relief and shifted his gaze away. He noticed that the golden-haired examinee in the first row had finally raised his head at that moment. Right after that, he noticed that this row of examiners was surrounding a middle-aged man in the middle, and that middle-aged man looked somewhat familiar. It was the examiner Su Lu had interviewed with in the morning. He narrowed his eyes slightly at the middle-aged examiner, and could not help but feel a little surprised. It looked like the other party's status in the Shell Motor Company was not low. The human resources manager of the Shell Motor Company engineering department, Jose, used a cold gaze to sweep across the faces of the examinees in the meeting room. Unlike his gaze, his mood was actually quite good. The results of this spring recruitment exam had greatly exceeded his expectations. It looked like the all-rounder plan of the Ministry of National Defense was indeed not bad. The most outstanding graduates of the 3 major military academies had indeed performed much better than the previous examinees. Of course, the one who made him even more satisfied and gave him endless surprises was still the examinee he had personally interviewed. Among the 7 examiners, Jose's rank was, of course, the highest. However, he was still the human resources manager of the engineering department, and this recruitment exam was the responsibility of the head office's human resources department. Therefore, the matter of announcing the results and arranging the research direction of the examinees who passed the exam was left to the other examiners. The recruitment of the Shell Motor Company was fundamentally different from the recruitment of other companies. However, the examinees who passed the recruitment exam would be directly assigned to different departments, and there was no collective training for new employees. On one hand, this was because the examinees recruited by the most famous company in the Federation were the most outstanding group of people, and they had to satisfy the company's requirements of being able to use them. On the other hand, the company had always believed that the training of new employees should be carried out in practice, and should not waste any time and money. Following the voice of the examiner with a serious expression, examinees left the meeting room dejectedly from time to time. These were all people who did not pass the exam. As for the examinees who passed the exam, they listened attentively to the department they would be assigned to. Although being able to enter the Shell Motor Company was already a very difficult matter, being assigned to the best and most important department was, of course, an even better thing. The examinees who did not know the results of the exam were extremely nervous as they waited. Among them, there were naturally some who were different. For example, the blonde examinee in the first row, Park Ji-ho, or the smiling Zhou Yu, or Su Lo. He was very clear that although he did not finish the last big question, he should have just passed the basic score. He only secretly wished in his heart that it would be best if he could enter the engineering department. This was because, within the Shell Motor Company, other than the Research Institute, the engineering department had the most access to the most advanced technology. A large part of the reason he wanted to enter the Shell Motor Company was because he wanted to get close to that information. Supervisor Jose glanced at his wristwatch and realized that the flight back to Hong Kong was getting closer. He gently patted the shoulder of the examiner in front of him and said a few words with a smile. Then, he stood in front of everyone. He stared at the examinees who were still sitting in the audience and said, "I am the Human Resources Supervisor of the Engineering Department, Jose." Hearing this sentence, there was a sudden commotion in the audience. These students from the 3 major military academies were very clear about the position of the engineering department in the Shell Motor Company. Other than the Research Institute, the engineering department should be the most advanced department. Originally, They did not expect to be able to enter the engineering department, but they did not expect that the human resources supervisor of the engineering department would be present in today's recruitment exam. What did this mean? I don't have much time, so I only have a few words to say. In today's recruitment exam, you all did very poorly. Only 7 people were able to pass the basic score. For those who passed the exam before, don't show the arrogance on your faces like you did in school. You all did not pass the basic score. The 7 examinees who passed the basic score, not bad. On behalf of the engineering department, I welcome all of you. The examinees in the meeting room were originally a little embarrassed, but after hearing this sentence, they could not help but become restless. They finally confirmed that the supervisor of the engineering department had personally come to the recruitment exam site to recruit people. All of the examinees wanted to enter the engineering department, so they all pricked up their ears, hoping that their names would come out from the supervisor's mouth. Even the examinees who had already been assigned to different departments were curiously watching. They did not know which lucky ones, or perhaps the most outstanding ones, would be chosen by the Shell Motor Company. The atmosphere in the meeting room was a little tense. Park Ji-ho, show you. After reading out the 6 names, Jose subconsciously paused for a moment. Show you, whose name was called out, smiled. The blonde examinee in the first row relaxed his body, but frowned. It was obvious that he was not satisfied with Zhou Yu's name being called out after his. The examinees in the meeting room were both surprised, not surprised to hear these 2 names. This was because the students from the 3 academies often interacted with each other. They were very clear that in this batch of students, Park Ji-ho from the 3 academies and Zhou Yu from the 1 academy were the most outstanding. They were curious about who the 7th name was. Could it be that his results were better than Park Ji-ho's and Zhou Yu's? But they heard that there were no outstanding people in this batch of students from the 2 academies. Jose smiled as he looked at the circle of people from the 1 academy. He said, Su Lo. Once these words were said, the crowd was in an uproar. The students from the 2 academies in the front row could not help but stand up and turn to look at the circle of people from the 1st Military Academy. They wanted to see who this unfamiliar name was in the 1st Academy. However, when they found out that the examinee chosen by the engineering department was actually the one they had previously mocked. Squatting soldier, everyone's expressions became extremely interesting. The only one who was mentally prepared, Zhou Yu, could not help but be surprised. He smiled and patted Su Li's shoulder. Everyone in the circle of people from the 1 academy was already stunned, especially the boorish Anda. At this moment, his mouth was wide open, and he looked at Su Lo as if he was looking at a monster. He was speechless for a long time. Chapter 154. When the white-haired old man walked into the meeting room, dozens of examinees were still immersed in the shock of hearing Su Li's name. When they suddenly heard such a loud voice, everyone curiously looked over. They did not know why this old man who suddenly appeared in the Shell Motor Company's meeting room would shout out Su Li's name. Some of the examinees even started to wonder if Su Lo had cheated during the exam and was found out by the company. That's right, if he did not cheat, how could this auditing student pass the exam? His performance was even more outstanding than the best students in the 3rd campus, and he was chosen by the human resources manager of the engineering department. Some of them even started to fantasize. If Su Lo was stripped of his qualifications and kicked out of the meeting room, would it be their turn to be on the list of 7 people? Seeing the white-haired old man who directly rushed into the meeting room, the examiners on the stage respectfully greeted him. Only the human resources manager of the engineering department, Mr. Jose, frowned and did not say a word. He glared fiercely at the bald examiner beside him. The bald examiner frowned and said, Mr. Jose, the research institute has been short of manpower recently. Especially this person, he has been cursing in the human resources department for the past 2 days. It's not that I deliberately revealed it, but he must have seen the results of the exam. At this time, an examiner introduced him to the examinees in the meeting room. This is Professor Shin from our company's research institute. Hearing the words research institute, the examinees in the meeting room were dumbfounded. If the engineering department was the most advanced department in terms of technology in the Shell Motor Company, then the research institute was the cornerstone of the entire Shell Motor Company. For countless years, the Research Institute had provided the Shell Motor Company and the Federation with an endless supply of wisdom and research results. However, this high and mighty Research Institute had always signed cooperation agreements with professors from various universities. They had never heard of recruitment through the Human Resources Department. Why did this old professor suddenly appear in the meeting room? Who is Su Lo? Professor Shin from the Research Institute did not pay attention to the examiner's introduction. He also did not pay attention to Mr. Jose's gaze. He shouted at the examinees below the stage. Su Lo was confused. He stood up and raised his hand. I am. Professor Shin looked at him, then looked at the printed test paper in his hand. He nodded with satisfaction and said, although your basic knowledge is a bit lacking, you can barely use it. You, come with me. This scammer called Su Lo was not only chosen by the engineering department, but he was also about to be recruited as a staff member of the Research Institute. This fact made the atmosphere in the conference room even more strange. Besides Su Lo, Shou Yu revealed a look of shock. Su Lo opened his mouth slightly, not understanding what had happened. The gazes of the examinees in the meeting room all landed on him. Envy, jealousy, shock, suspicion, and all sorts of emotions were present. Park Ji-ho, who was sitting in the first row, was also staring at Su Lo. His slender eyes, which were partially covered by his golden hair, were filled with disbelief and jealousy. Professor Shin, who came from the Research Institute, said to the examiner from the Human Resources Department, help him with the procedures. At this moment, Mr. Jose, who had been silent, finally could not help but say, wait. This examinee has already been chosen by the engineering department. Professor Shin looked at him and frowned. He said, I need manpower for my research project. The few thousand engineers in your engineering department are not enough for you. The engineering department is not the Bureau of Proclamations Human Resources Committee. We don't have extra people. Mr. Jose did not budge. The Research Institute wants people and the engineering department wants them. Do you want me to go to the board of directors? This was only a small matter. Of course, it was not enough to alarm the Shell Motor Company's board of directors. However, Professor Shin was very confident in his words. After all, the Research Institute's position in the company was unshakable. The key is the examinee's own will. The board of directors cannot go against the wishes of the staff and arbitrarily transfer them. Mr. Jose said coldly. He then turned his head and said to Su Lo, don't be scared by the reputation of the Research Institute. Young people like you will want to transfer out in 3 days if you go to that kind of lifeless place. Also, I have seen Professor Zhou's recommendation letter. Your hands-on ability is the strongest. The engineering department is the most suitable department for you. At this moment, the people in the meeting room were dumbfounded. Especially the examiners on the stage, they could not help but smile bitterly. Who would have thought that this year's spring recruitment would actually alarm the 2 major departments in the company? The most important thing was that these 2 departments were actually fighting over a single examinee. What was the most expensive thing in the 37th century? Sure enough, it was a talent that at the side door of the Shell Motor Company. The young people who had just finished their exams waved goodbye. However, when they looked at the group of people in the first military academy, they could not help but feel a little complicated. This was all because of the guy standing next to Zhou Yu. The blonde Park Ji-ho slowly walked in front of the people from the first military academy. He first nodded slightly to greet Shou-yu, then he stared at the ordinary-looking Su-lo. After a moment of silence, he asked, "I still don't understand why the Research Institute and the Engineering Department have chosen you." Anda looked at this person with disgust and said gruffly, "You idiot. Of course it's because you did well in the exam." The students from the first military academy did not have a good impression of Su-lo. They had even mocked him at the beginning. However, under Shou-yu's influence, their performance was much better than the other examinees. Anda felt that Su-lo was an awesome person, and he seemed to be Shou-yu's friend. Of course, he would stand up and be a door god, and play the bad guy. After Park Ji-ho left, Shou-yu smiled at Su-lo and said, "The bus back to school is waiting for us. Are you going the same way?" Su-lo shook his head. The two exchanged contact information and waved goodbye. When the side door returned to silence, he retracted his gaze from the street and walked into the automatic tunnel beside the flower bed. He walked towards the parking lot at the corner of West 13th Street. The parking lot in the basement of the Capital Special District was very clearly planned. Moreover, the parking lot was exceptionally large. It was the size of 5 football fields. Su-lo gripped the armrest tightly under the dim light. He felt a little strange in his heart. The bloody Mecca in the underground parking lot of Linhai Gymnasium had always been a rather depressing memory in his mind. The automatic caterpillar tunnel carried his body forward in the parking lot. He narrowed his eyes and thought, when was the last time he played football? It seemed to be 6 or 7 years ago at the back of Zhonglo Street. He played with Weizi and the others. Ever since he met Uncle Feng-yu and started to repair home appliances, he never played again. When he arrived at the H section of the parking lot, Su-lo pressed the key in his hand. Not far away, a black car automatically ignited and let out a soft welcoming sound. He glanced at the H section above the parking lot and could not help but smile. He thought of the young man he met in the H section. The black car had no logo. It was a gift from Tai Yuan to Su-lo before he left. After sitting in the car, Su-lo did not immediately leave. Instead, he silently closed his eyes and began to think about what happened at the Shell Motor Company today. Leaning against the comfortable seat, Su-lo closed his eyes as if he was about to fall asleep. Entering the Shell Motor Company, on one hand, was because this was his dream and the future he had promised to someone. More importantly, it was because he needed to solve some problems that were very troubling to him. The images in his mind were too strange. There were many blueprints that he did not know the purpose of. Today, during the exam, he found a very similar blueprint, which made him more determined. He had to figure out the strange things that were happening in his body as soon as possible. He had to figure out what was going on with that strange black dream. If these things were related to the chip behind his neck, then he had to figure out the secret of this camouflage chip. The best places in the Federation in this area were the Federal Academy of Science and the Shell Motor Company. His performance today and the sensation he caused were completely different from his usual style of doing things. This was because he knew that in a top company like the Shell Motor Company, with his ability, there was no need to talk about hiding. In order to climb up the ranks among countless outstanding peers, in order to possibly come into contact with the core technology of the Federation in a very short period of time, he had to fully utilize his ability. Only technology could be used to get close to technology itself. It was also because of this reason. Although the Human Resources Director of the Engineering Department patiently explained the pros and cons of the two in the office, as well as the problems of the Research Institute, he still chose to follow Professor Shin into the Research Institute. After all, the research of the Shell Motor Company in the field of microchips was recognized by the Federation as second to none. Su-lo knew that he had some talent in the field of mechanical repair, and in the few years he had followed Uncle Feng-yu, he had unknowingly grasped a lot of knowledge about high-end equipment in the Federation from the process of repairing home appliances. But he also knew that if the Black Dream didn't leave him with so many strange blueprints, he definitely wouldn't have been able to solve the last question in today's exam. Thinking of this, he opened his eyes. His eyes revealed a trace of reminiscence. His right hand subconsciously touched the back of his neck. Although his finger didn't feel any protrusion, he knew that there was an extremely small chip underneath. Uncle is the truly awesome person. Sulu exclaimed in his heart. He always thought that the blueprints that appeared in front of his eyes due to the abnormal discharge of his brain were the information that Uncle left in the chip. Although he didn't understand how so much information could be integrated into a microchip, he clearly understood that his brain was now equivalent to an extremely large and complex database. What he didn't know was that the blueprints in his mind were things that didn't even exist in the Federal Academy of Sciences database. And these pictures weren't left in the chip by Uncle, but by a great existence of data. In order to wake him up from his coma, it used the second type of communication method. What he didn't know was that he was the fugitive with the best luck in the universe. Chapter 155. The reason why Sulu had always assumed that the dark dream, as well as the series of images that appeared on his retina, was something that Uncle Feng Yu had left in the chip, and did not think in any other direction, was because of the inertia of human thought. Since Sulu knew that there was a problem with the chip, naturally, when a strange situation occurred, he would think in that direction. Naturally, he would not have thought that it was the glory of the charter of human society that had created such a miraculous outcome. This was because he had always thought that as long as the Bureau of Proclamation discovered the problem with his chip, then what awaited him would be the end of the road as a fugitive. For Sulu, the more convincing evidence was actually the various pictures of beautiful women mixed in with those images. Other than that lecherous uncle who frequented the sanatorium for prostitutes, who else would use such cutting-edge technology to seal these useless pornographic images into the chip and store them in his mind? Suli's lips curled into a bitter smile, and he muttered to himself, "This lecherous fellow, should I call you Feng Yu, or Professor Jean? How many identities did you actually have in the past?" Pursued by the federal military in the Donglin region, replaced with a brand new chip in the suburbs of Hishi region, followed the method left by Uncle Feng Yu to leave the planet full of mining pits, entered Yue University with a recommendation letter of unknown content, accidentally entered Section H1 of the library in Section H, and met Tai Yuan from there. The mysterious power in his body, the faint connection between this power and the ice-cold metal mecha, the dark dream after he had fainted, the scenes in the dream, link after link, until today, Sulu was very confident that all of this was related to Feng Yu. At least, some of the links were definitely the result of someone's deliberate arrangement. He did not know whether this arrangement was good or bad, but at least he knew that he was still alive. The other side of being alive was that he already knew that he was no longer an ordinary person, and naturally could not expect to live the life of an ordinary person. On his left hand was an inconspicuous metal bracelet. Sulu narrowed his eyes as he looked at the bracelet, thinking about the chip inside that was as bright as a star. He had also thought about whether he should try out all the chips in the bracelet to see the identity and life that those chips represented. However, the pain of replacing the chips made his heart palpitate. He was also worried that this kind of unnecessary action would trigger the omnipresent the glory of the charter, so he never took the risk. Instead, he took it slowly according to his character. There was also a thought that was deeply rooted in his heart that prevented him from using the rest of the chips in the bracelet for the time being. In his conjecture, before Uncle Feng Yu came to the Eastwood region, he must have been like a mysterious ghost with 3,000 incarnations, floating in the starry sky of the Federation and traveling the world. And this kind of life that was destined to be impossible to stay in one place for a long time, destined to be separated from the people and things around him, was not what Sulu wanted. With a slight movement of his left hand, the car slowly started. With a low and pleasant sound, it drove out of the underground parking lot like a ghost that a very ordinary black car without obvious signs was driving on the streets of the capital special district. Sulu looked at the street beside the car expressionlessly, trying to get away from the prompts of the electronic map as soon as possible and familiarize himself with the streets and alleys of the capital. Another important reason for choosing the Research Institute instead of the Engineering Department was that the Nutshell Engineering Department was in Harbor City, and the Research Institute was in the Capital Special District. The final battlefield of the upcoming presidential election would definitely be in the Capital Special District. He would definitely stay on the battlefield to see what would happen to the counselor named Macklin. Sulu never thought that Tai Yuan owed him anything, and he was very clear that big shots at that level, even if they respected friendship, could still give up anything in the face of family interests. He could not put all his hopes on that distant friend of his. He had to watch in person. If everything did not go as he wished in the future, perhaps he would do something himself. At least Tai Yuan had given him a car that he really wanted. In the snowstorm of Linhai, he had followed Shi Qinghai to escape the pursuit of the Federation Investigation Bureau. The experience of running wildly on that stretch of road had deeply affected Sulu. The first time he had driven a car, and he had driven so crazily. That kind of thrill, that kind of nervousness and excitement, and that feeling of perfect unity between man and machine, all made Sulu fall in love with driving. This was very similar to the feeling of operating a mecha, but it was more direct, so the thrill was even more intense. Even so, the black car driving on the streets of the capital at this time was exceptionally stable, maintaining a speed of around 70 kilometers per hour. This was due to his personality. In front of the public, Sulu was still that somewhat stuffy, somewhat wooden fellow. The Capital Special District did not occupy a large area, but it gathered all of the important government departments of the Human Federation, as well as the various administrative agencies under the Management Committee. In addition to those large corporate headquarters that spanned across several star systems, there was not much extra land left. Thus, the cost of living in the Special District was rather high. Until today, other than those high-class residential districts that belonged to the Federation government, there was no other residential district that could be formed. Most Federation citizens living in the capital would live in the 7 satellite cities within a radius of 100 kilometers or so of the Capital Special District. The apartment that Sulu had rented in advance was in City 2. After bypassing the traffic, the black car silently and steadily got onto Highway 2. It began to speed up without anyone noticing. Perhaps the car's stability was too strong, or perhaps the driver's ability was too good, but despite gradually exceeding 100 kilometers per hour, there was no sense of high speed. Soothing music began to play, and Sulu pressed the touch screen to call up the car's computer system. He began to drive the car while diligently learning about the relevant aspects of the car. During the assassination in the Linhai State Underground parking lot, the incomparably strong anti-attack capabilities of this black car had left an extremely deep impression on Sulu. He knew that this car was definitely not as simple as it looked on the outside. It was just that after receiving the car at the capital airport, he had not had much time to study it, so he did not know what other remarkable aspects of the car's craftsmanship were. Just as Sulu was engrossed in his thoughts, the car's computer suddenly beeped with an alarm. Beep, beep, dangerous vehicle approaching. Sulu's nerves suddenly tightened, but before he had time to react, he only saw an extremely bright red shadow on his left. With a whoosh, it overtook the car, leaving behind only a strong gust of wind. The alarm was lifted, and Sulu silently watched the red sports car leaving behind a trail of dust. He recognized that it was one of the Federation's top luxury cars, the Lotus, and the Red Lotus was the most eye-catching and expensive of these luxury cars. The reason why it was expensive was because the Red Lotus did not use clean energy, nor did it use hybrid power, but instead used an old-fashioned gasoline engine. Although it was old-fashioned, its power output was much higher than that of an electric car or a hybrid power car. Judging with the naked eye, Sulu determined that the Red Lotus was going at least 200 kilometers per hour when it overtook him. The capital special region was filled with high-ranking officials, and naturally there was also a group of young people with special privileges. These rich young people did not need to serve in the military, and had nothing to do all day long, so they could only look for supplements in the spiritual world. Some people might bury themselves in books, some would sink into the sea of lust, some would explore everywhere, but most people still chose to look for all kinds of excitement. Drag racing was, without a doubt, the most historical and most popular kind of activity. After all, this was the capital special region. Countless powers and countless media outlets had their eyes on this place. These descendants of influential people were relatively restrained, but in the other provinces, these descendants of influential people were even more arrogant. Sulu had also heard that these descendants of influential people in the capital special region were not very willing to drag race on the streets of the special region, because it could easily cause trouble for their parents. Moreover, there were too many high-ranking officials in the special region, so who knew what kind of trouble they could not afford to provoke. These descendants of influential people mostly chose to drag race on the roads leading out of the city, especially the highways leading to several satellite cities, as well as the inner streets of the satellite cities. Sulig did not expect that he would encounter a drag racer just a few days after arriving in the capital special region. Being overtaken by the Red Lotus in a dangerous and provocative manner, Suli's mood did not change in the slightest. Different from his age, he had already experienced too many things, so naturally he was not that easily angered, nor was he that competitive. Just like the black car he was driving at this time, keeping it to himself was a common trait of their personalities. Sulig did not have the impulse to cause trouble, but trouble took the initiative to find him. He watched as the figure of the Red Lotus slowed down and gradually became clearer. His eyes gradually narrowed. The other party had slowed down, so they must be waiting for something. He could only hope that it was not waiting for his unremarkable black car. However, what made him feel somewhat helpless was that the Red Lotus's target was him. Especially when he reduced the speed to 30 km per hour, which was already exceeding the speed limit of the highway, the Red Lotus still did not leave because of his retreat. Instead, it also reduced its speed. In the end, this Red Lotus, shockingly braked directly and abruptly stopped in front of Sulu, firmly blocking the black car's path. Sulu frowned slightly, not understanding what was going on. A girl came down from the Red Lotus and walked directly in front of the black car, looking over coldly. In the chilly weather of early spring, this girl wore a short red windbreaker. The windbreaker reached her knees, revealing a pair of seductive legs. The girl coldly looked at the black car, but her gaze gradually turned cold and even somewhat despairing. Tears gushed out, turning the heavy makeup on her eyes into 2 lines of black rain. Chapter 156. Through the glass, Sulu looked at the crying girl in red. For some reason, a part of his heart was touched, and he felt a little sour. He knew that the glass of this black car was a little strange, and that people outside could not see the people inside the car. Therefore, he was sure that this girl named Zoe must have mistaken him for someone else. He just did not know why she was crying so sadly. In Linhai Prefecture's 13, a nightclub that used the ancient language to pretend to be cultured, the red-clothed girl was an extremely cold and arrogant daughter of a powerful family. In Yue University's Double Moon Festival Ball, the red-clothed girl pretended to be a calm and elegant daughter of a rich family. But no matter which one it was, Sulu didn't like her very much. Although he and Shi Qinghai were a team, they had never been at a disadvantage in front of this girl named Zhou Yu, who was used to wearing red. But Sulu did not think that he would have the slightest good impression of this girl. He only felt a little disgust. But for some reason, on the highway on the outskirts of the capital special administrative region, far away from Linhai, seeing this woman crying helplessly and hopelessly, seeing her beautiful face covered in heavy makeup that gradually turned into ink rain, Sulu actually felt some sympathy for her. Probably because not long ago, he had also cried helplessly and hopelessly. We only see each other twice in 2 years. In these few months, other than sending me a New Year's greeting card, you don't even want to see me. Why is that? Do you know how painful it has been these past few months? Of course, you are the high and mighty crown prince. What am I? I am a woman that your family gave you with both hands. You don't even like me. Even if I am nothing, we were friends in the past. Don't you care about me at all? I don't want that kind of care. It's just that my mood is really bad right now. There are a lot of things that I don't dare to tell my family. And now you disappeared too. Zoe cried, and even shouted hysterically at the black car. Her slightly curly hair was draped over her shoulders, and her extremely thick makeup was like a colorful wall that had been washed away by rain, revealing the miserable and pale skin underneath. Sulu had occasionally heard Tai Yuan mention the Zhou family siblings at the general hospital and at the seaside. Most of the time, it was about Zhou Yu. Tai Yuan had asked him to forget about the conflict in Linhai Prefecture. After all, the Zhou family was the influence that the Tai family had nurtured in the Federation government. In those two conflicts, Su Lu and Shi Qinghai didn't suffer any losses. In fact, they even took advantage of the situation. Therefore, he didn't take it seriously and had completely forgotten about this ruthless girl in red. Who would have thought that he would meet her in the outskirts of the special district of the capital city today? What's more, she was different from her usual self. She seemed particularly desperate and real. Sulu knew that this girl in red must have mistaken him for Tai Yuan because of this unmarked black car. That was why she was so angry and lost her composure. He narrowed his eyes slightly. He didn't know how to solve this problem in front of him, but he knew that he couldn't let her continue to misunderstand him. Otherwise, if she said something more serious, the trouble would become even bigger. He gently pressed a button, and the car's computer immediately responded. The window that was covered with a layer of film gradually turned transparent, revealing Su Li's ordinary face. Zhou Yu's angry words came to an abrupt halt. She looked at the young man in the black car in astonishment. She was somewhat puzzled, and then shocked speechless. She easily recognized Su Lu. When she thought about how her previous loss of composure was completely seen by this hateful young man, endless shame and embarrassment welled up in her heart. This feeling was so strong that it turned into anger in the end. She fiercely glared at Su Lu on the other side of the car window. She wiped the tears on her face, and without saying anything, simply returned to her red Lotus sports car, leaving behind a stunned and speechless Su Lu. Seeing the red Lotus sports car start to move, Su Li's eyebrows slightly furrowed. He lightly stepped on the accelerator, and the black car started to move again. He followed her from a distance. He didn't know what he had discovered, but he didn't choose to leave this troublesome person. The two cars in front and behind didn't go too fast. They drove on the second highway toward the second city district. Su Lu had discovered something, so he decided to temporarily follow the cold young lady for a while. However, Zhou Yu, who was sitting in the red Lotus sports car in front of him, didn't leave at high speed for some unknown reason. At this moment, the car's computer's warning sounded again. A completely serene blue luxury sports car overtook the black car in the left lane at high speed, leaving behind a blue streak of light. In an instant, it disappeared at the curve in front of them. The speed was really too fast. Su Li's thighs slightly twitched, feeling a trace of nervousness and awe. This was because he discovered that when this serene blue luxury sports car quickly entered the curve, the red Lotus in front of them also instantly sped up. The two cars simultaneously drove at a terrifying speed toward the end of the second highway. After that chase with the Federation Investigation Bureau, Sulu fell in love with the feeling of driving. He also crammed his knowledge on cars. He recognized at a glance that the serene blue sports car's brand name was Silver Spirit. The full name was Silver Wraith, and the serene blue Silver Wraith was the most expensive in this series. Once the horsepower was fully unleashed, its speed was extremely shocking. However, it was also extremely expensive. It wasn't a car that the average child of a powerful family could own. Zhou Yingxing had already become the Deputy Minister of National Defense of the Federation. No matter how amazing the background of a second-generation figure was, it was impossible for them to really hurt Miss Zhou. Moreover, Su Lo couldn't find any reason to worry about the safety of that cold young lady. However, he didn't know why, but after a moment of silent contemplation, he stepped on the gas pedal to its limit. The black car suddenly turned into a black shadow in the twilight on the outskirts of the capital. It looked more like a real ghost than the silver wraith in front of it. It was incomparably smooth and stable as it quickly followed, trailing behind the blue and red wind lines from a distance. Su Li's expression was heavy, and a faint anger appeared in his eyes. His hands gently placed on the steering wheel, his eyes looking straight ahead as he allowed the car's computer to search for his target. The black car had already entered the second satellite city of the capital, the city known as Huangdu. At this time, pedestrians and cars had been on the streets for a long time. It was very lively, and the two sports cars he had been following were long gone. Su Lu was angry at himself because he had lost track of the other party, but because he had witnessed the speed of the two sports cars with his own eyes, he really couldn't feel happy. In such a crowded area, the two sports cars, Red Lotus and Blue Wraith, didn't slow down at all. They ran a few red lights and were surrounded by danger. There were a few times when they almost hit pedestrians crossing the road. Although Zhou Yu and the people in the Blue Wraith sports car were very skilled at driving and didn't cause any tragedies in the end, Su Lu, who witnessed everything from behind, felt his heart sink. People who didn't care about the lives of ordinary Federation citizens really made him feel ashamed. On the highway, Su Li's black car followed the two sports cars in front of him from afar. The high-speed black car still maintained a stable trajectory, giving people a visual illusion. However, its speed was already close to the two expensive sports cars in front. However, after entering the city, Su Lo couldn't do such a despicable thing. He could only watch as the two cars rolled up the green leaves and disappeared in front of the street under the remote highway of Huangdu City. The street lights were dim, and it was unusually quiet. At the entrance to the mountain near Qingshan Park, there were 5 sports cars of different styles and colors, but they were all extremely luxurious and expensive. One of them was a bright red Lotus sports car with a slightly deformed front cover. It was leaning against the mountain rock wall, and beside it was a 1-meter-deep drainage ditch. A few well-dressed young men were currently whispering something to the red Lotus sports car. None of them noticed that a black car was slowly driving over like a ghost. Through the window, Su Lu looked at the crashed red sports car from afar. He noticed that Zhou Yu was squatting by the drainage ditch and vomiting non-stop. He didn't know if it was because of the shock or because she was frightened. Su Lu looked over there in silence. He had a strange feeling in his heart. Although he knew that his guess was a bit ridiculous, if it was true, he had to get confirmation from the other party. This was because to him, this was related to his most important friend. He couldn't ignore it. Those well-dressed young people were definitely trouble. Su Lu didn't want to cause trouble. He originally wanted to wait for the other party to disperse before asking Zhou Yu in private. However, he suddenly realized that the cars seemed to be preparing to continue racing on the night road up the mountain. Moreover, Zhou Yu, who was vomiting, seemed to want to change cars to continue. It was too dangerous to race on the mountain road at night. Su Lu drove the car to the side of the girl in red, and the door opened automatically. He hesitated for a moment, lowered the window, handed over a bottle of purified water and a tissue, and said, "Do you want to take a rest in the car?" When the black car approached the entrance of Qingshan Park, those well-dressed young people noticed it. especially a few of them who were quite knowledgeable about cars. When they heard the sound of the black car, they felt that something was wrong. Their eyes lit up. Zhou took the water in shock. Her makeup was still a mess because of her tears. Especially now that it had dried up, it looked even weirder. She took the tissue and water, but didn't drink. Instead, she wiped her face. It seemed that no matter what kind of situation she was in, women always cared about their face the most. After a moment of silence, for some unknown reason, she actually went around to the other side of the gate and got into the black car. "Why are you following me? You've been following me from the highway to here. Aren't you Zhang Xiaoming's boyfriend?" Sitting in the passenger seat, Zhou naturally unbuttoned her red trench coat and sneered. Although she didn't necessarily think that Su Lo was a guy who was obsessed with her appearance, the blade in her words flew in that direction. It had to be said that Zhou was a very beautiful woman. Especially now that the heavy makeup on her face was gone, revealing the real delicate skin underneath. She returned to her true age and added a bit of radiance to her appearance. Zhang Xiaoming is dead. Su Lo was silent for a moment before he answered softly. The black car suddenly fell into a strange silence. Zhou seemed to want to say something, but in the end, she just sneered and didn't speak. Chapter 157. Upon hearing the news of Zhang Xiaoming's death, Zhou fell silent. Although she wasn't close with the girl, she was still someone she knew. Especially recently, she found that because of that incident, she had some endocrine imbalance and became sentimental. In order to not let her eyes become moist for no reason, she chose to make her face more indifferent and her mind more empty. At that moment, she heard Su Li's question. This question was very natural. It was like a young woman in a coffee shop covering her mouth and giggling while asking a female friend next to her. It was also like a mother nervously and joyfully asking her daughter. No one knew about that incident. In order to hide it, Zhou, who had already fallen out with her family, simply moved out. For so many days, she hadn't told anyone about this incident. It weighed on her heart, making her feel extremely painful and troubled. Su Li's ordinary face and gentle and steady pace of speech often made the people around him feel close and trustworthy. Although Zhou wasn't his friend, when she heard such a natural question, the pressure that had accumulated over the past few days seemed to have found a breakthrough. She naturally replied bitterly, "It's been more than 3 months." As soon as this sentence came out, Zhou's expression suddenly froze. She suddenly turned around and stared coldly at Su Li's face. After Su Lu confirmed his guess, the expression on his face became more serious and concerned. "How did you know?" The extremely cold expression didn't last long. It immediately collapsed into a pale and slightly panicked face. Zhou looked at Su Lu and asked in a trembling voice. Su Li's eyes lowered and landed on her lower abdomen. If it weren't for his sharper eyes than the average person, he definitely wouldn't have noticed the slight bump. "You're pregnant. Why are you still racing?" "It's too dangerous," Su Lu said. There was no makeup on Zhou's face. She was pure and beautiful. When she heard the word pregnant, a trace of desolation suddenly appeared on her face. It was just like that morning a long time ago when she left an unfamiliar apartment. She burst into tears like a broken pot. "It's none of your business. If I remember correctly, we don't know each other that well. In fact, we've always been enemies," Zhou said. Su Lu had no interest in arguing with her. He only knew that he had guessed one thing correctly, and with the confirmation of her pregnancy date, his second guess was about to come to fruition. On the night after the Double Moon Festival Ball, the pair involved in the scene on the grass beside the Rose River did not know that he had already seen it. Su Lu was silent as he considered his choice of words. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed that the few well-dressed young men beside the car had already cast strange glances at his car. Without waiting for him to open his mouth to ask, Zhou suddenly said coldly, "I didn't expect the Crown Prince to actually give you this car. It seems like you really are a subordinate that the Tai family values. He has a lot of cars." "It's not strange that he gave me one," Zhou corrected. "I'm not his subordinate. I'm his friend." Hearing the word friend, Zhou's slightly red eyes flashed with a strange light. She immediately said mockingly, "Someone like him has friends. Someone like you is worthy of being his friend." These words were very disdainful and humiliating, but Zhou acted as if he didn't hear it at all. "How is the Crown Prince now?" "I don't know. I haven't contacted him in a few days. Originally, he was supposed to finish studying in Lin High for half a year and then directly go to the West Woods to join the army. However, since he ended his studies early, I don't know where he will go." Looking at the lonely girl in red beside him, Zhou slightly narrowed his eyes. Only now did he remember that this girl and Tai Xuan were the same year. She was younger than him and was a real girl. However, in the past, the vitality and innocence that a young girl should have was covered up by her cold personality and gorgeous makeup. After Zhou heard about Tai Xuan's recent situation, she became silent. Her rosy lips slightly opened as if she wanted to continue asking, but in the end, she only remained silent. Seeing her companions walking towards the car, she was about to get out of the car when Zhou called her back. "Don't go racing. It's too dangerous for you and others," Zhou said softly to her as he looked out the window at the expensive blue sports car not far away. Zhou laughed mockingly. "Who do you think you are? You actually dare to control me like that old man of mine. Whether you live or die has nothing to do with me. I also don't like trash like you who don't care about human lives." Zhou was rarely so mean. He turned his head and looked at her with narrowed eyes. He said word by word, "But right now, the life in your belly has a lot to do with me, so naturally, I have to control you." Zhou was a smart person. She didn't misunderstand these words. Instead, she very sensitively discovered that this ordinary person named Zhou. Perhaps he had already guessed the true identity of the father of the child in her belly. This was because she knew very well that this person and Zhou beside her were very close friends. Her face suddenly became even paler. She looked at Zhou in a daze. In her shock, she forgot to get out of the car. The few well-dressed young people were originally discussing the night run. However, when they saw Zhou get into the black car that suddenly arrived, they were silent. They were guessing the identity of the black car's owner in their hearts. These people's families had considerable status in the special capital region. However, their father's company had to maintain a good relationship with the National Defense Department's Deputy Minister Zhou, who was in charge of logistics. Naturally, they didn't want to disturb the conversation between Miss Zhou and her friends. "Where do you live? I'll send you back and ask you some questions." "I can't leave yet. I lost a bet with someone today. If I can't win it back in the night run, I have to pay for the bet." For some reason, Zhou calmly explained. The people outside the car seemed to be a little impatient, especially when the blue silver Spirit sports car flashed its lights twice. A young man walked to the car window, gently knocked, and said with a smile, "Sister Zhou, are you still running tonight? They're urging us." Although they didn't want to offend Zhou, they didn't want to offend the owner of the blue silver Spirit sports car even more. Although until tonight, they still didn't know the name of the owner of the car, they had been warned from all sides that this was a big shot that they couldn't afford to offend. At this time, a middle-aged man got out of the blue silver Spirit sports car. He walked straight to Su Li's car and said coldly, "Miss Zhou, the young master said that we have 3 people in the car, and he'll let you sit empty for 5 minutes. If you're not in the mood tonight, or you don't want to change cars, then please drink this bottle of wine. A bottle of aged wine was in the middle-aged man's hand. It seemed that today's bet on Highway 2 was a bottle of wine. It was strange. Although the descendants of the Federation's rich and powerful definitely wouldn't be so bored as to gamble, it was a bit surprising that they would only drink a bottle of wine. The car window slowly rolled down. Sulu said, "She won't be running today, and she won't drink the wine either." Sulu thought of the thrilling scene on the streets of Wangdu City. He didn't have the slightest good impression of the person in the blue-silver Spirit sports car. It was the same for Zhou Yu, who drove the Red Lotus. He shouldn't have gotten involved in this trouble, but at this time, since he already knew that Zhou Yu's slightly swollen abdomen could be the descendant of that lazy guy, he definitely wouldn't let Zhou Yu race so crazily again. As for something like wine, could a pregnant woman drink it? Su Li's reply made the middle-aged man slightly stunned. Immediately, a gloomy expression appeared on his face. He thought that his young master had already given enough face to this young miss from the Zhou family by only letting her drink a bottle of wine as a gesture. He didn't expect that the owner of the black car, who had suddenly appeared, would reject him so cleanly and without giving him any face. "This is between my young master and Miss Zhou. May I ask who you are?" He didn't know the identity of the ordinary-looking young man in the black car, but he thought that since the other party was sitting together with Zhou Yu, he must not be an ordinary person, so his tone of reply was still polite. Before Su Lu could answer, Zhou Yu replied with a faint smile, "I don't know him. I overtook his car on the road, but I didn't expect him to follow me here." Su Li's pair of knife-like eyebrows furrowed slightly. He knew that the woman beside him had habitually started to cause trouble again. The middle-aged man walked toward the blue sports car, but the expressions of the well-dressed young men beside the car changed slightly. They believed Zhou Yu's words and thought that Su Lu was just an outsider. "Don't interfere in things you don't understand." One of them narrowed his eyes and looked at Su Lu. He said, "I heard that the sound of your car is not bad. Looks like it took a lot of effort to modify it. Do you want to go one round? I'm not someone who doesn't take my life and other people's lives seriously." Su Lu didn't have a good impression of these people outside the car, and Zhou Yu's words put him in a bad mood. Although he still spoke calmly, there was a trace of impoliteness in his tone. "I'm giving you face, but you don't want it." The young man's expression changed. He kicked the car door heavily and scolded, "Get out of the car." Whether it was in the nightclub or in the GU, Su Lu was used to the faces of these people in the Federation's privileged class, so he was not surprised by the other party's violent reaction. He was not worried that the other party's foot would be hurt. The car window rolled up, blocking out the scolding outside. He turned to look at Zhou Yu and said, "Why do you have to cause trouble for me? With your status, since you came to provoke me, trouble will naturally accompany you." Zhou Yu glanced at the people outside the car, but had no intention of getting out. She smiled and said, "You rejected the other party on my behalf. In their eyes, this is a very embarrassing thing. Since you have already offended them, you have to completely subdue them. To put it bluntly, this is what this circle is all about." There was a trace of tiredness and coldness in her indifferent smile. She said, "If you can be more arrogant than them, they naturally won't dare to be arrogant in front of you." Those arrogant young people had already blocked in front of Su Li's car. Two of them were even preparing to go back to the car to get their weapons. It seemed that these people didn't just disregard human life when they were racing, they were also the same on a normal day. Su Lu shook his head and said, "I don't want to take this kind of class, and I'm not a member of this circle. I really hate you people. For people like you, it seems that it is more appropriate to use your fists, just like outside the ball." He did not get out of the car to use his fists, although he knew very well that when it came to fists, there were probably not many people in the Federation who were a match for him. Even the special forces of the Federation were the same. He stepped on the accelerator. The car under him suddenly sped up. Amid the screeching sound of the tires grinding against the ground at high speed, it rushed forward. Zhou Yu's face paled. She looked at the people in front of the car and the expensive sports car and screamed, "What are you doing?" Chapter 158. Under the violent impact, the white sports car was bounced up from the ground and then fell to the ground, deformed like a crispy biscuit. The distance between the two workshops was too close, so the impact couldn't be too big, so the deformation wasn't too serious. However, the smooth curve of the car's waist could only be judged as ugly. It lost all its beauty and looked very miserable. Especially at that moment, the sound of metal being deformed and torn apart was a great torture to the eardrums. Su Luk stepped on the accelerator, and the black car crashed, shocking the group of Federation rich and powerful people. They had seen ruthless people, but they had never seen such a ruthless person. They were used to their arrogance, but they didn't expect that someone would use such an indifferent attitude to suppress their arrogance. These people scattered with pale faces, afraid that the guy in the black car would go 70 kilometers per hour at the entrance of Green Mountain Park. The door of the dark blue Spectre sports car that had been parked at the side opened. The middle-aged man who looked like a butler got out of the front passenger seat and said to the black car in a more respectful tone than before, "Friend in the car, young master would like to invite you for a drink." The bet was a bottle of wine, which wasn't a big deal in itself, but now it became a drink. The faces of the scattered young people changed slightly, as if they didn't expect that the person in the car, who was known for his ruthlessness, would be so afraid of the person in the black car that he didn't even hesitate to show weakness. Even the housekeeper didn't know why the young master in the car would ask him to come out and smooth things over for the young masters after a moment of silence. However, to everyone's surprise, the person in the black car didn't answer, and directly continued to step on the accelerator. In the sound of impact, the car squeezed out a path at the entrance of Green Mountain Park, turned into a silent black phantom smoke, and disappeared from everyone's sight extremely quickly. After a while, a young man cursed loudly and angrily and threw the golf club in his hand to the ground. It was only then that he realized that the white sports car he liked very much had been forcefully knocked into the drainage ditch of the mountain rain by that unknown black car. The drainage ditch beside the mountain road was not deep, only about 1 meter deep. The scene of the white sports car slowly falling into the ditch with a mournful cry left a deep impression on him. The blue phantom sports car opened its door in the pleasant mechanical sound of electric current, and two young people got out of the car. One of them had blonde hair, a tall and straight figure, and was indescribably handsome. It was the ace student of the 3rd Military Academy, Park Ji-ho. The mixture of the aura of a military officer and a playboy gave a very deep impression to people. But Park Ji-ho's presence could not overshadow the presence of the person beside him. That person was about 25 or 26 years old. His facial features were deep, and his eyes were gloomy and calm. He was wearing a set of casual clothes that did not seem to be branded. Just by standing there casually, he exuded the aura of someone who did not care to break the snow. "I don't know which family he is from, but he didn't recognize your car." Park Ji-ho slightly frowned and said. Although his tone was very calm when talking to the person next to him, trying to speak in a tone of equality, there was still a little concession and respect in the details. The man in casual clothes smiled slightly and said, "That black car looks ordinary, but it's actually very good. It has been following me and Zhou Yu since the highway, and we couldn't get rid of him. Since Zhou Yu knows that person, and is so obedient to him, he must be from that family." "Tai family." "Impossible, that prince has always been mysterious, but as far as I know, no matter where he appears now, there must be countless security personnel following him." "I didn't say Tai Yuan, after all, I haven't seen that prince." The young man in casual clothes gradually stopped smiling and said, such a deliberately ordinary car, and it doesn't have a military license plate. Only the Thai family, who always likes to be mysterious and low-key, would do something like this. After his smile disappeared, the corner of his mouth naturally curved into a mocking curve. Very few people have seen the heir of the Thai family. How many years has it been? That family still refuses to lower themselves, and only knows how to pretend to be mysterious. However, no matter how mysterious they are still being watched. The incident at the beginning of the year can be considered a lesson. When Park Ji-ho heard this, he smiled slightly and didn't say anything. He was a very outstanding and proud young man, but unfortunately, in front of the person next to him, he didn't have much to be proud of. Since that was the case, he might as well not talk too much. He knew very well that the person next to him was the same as himself, and didn't know the truth of the incident in Linhai. The Federation government and the Thai family covered up the incident very tightly. The other important people in the upper class of the Federation only knew about the incident, but not the details. I heard that Lady Thai has always liked the daughter of Deputy Minister So. The young man in casual clothes narrowed his eyes slightly and said, "I've already given enough face." The other party didn't give face to that last glass of wine, but I won't get angry over something like this. At the end of the mountain road in the distance, the lights were turned on and off. It seemed that the black car had already circled around this section of the road and entered Gwangdu City. Park Ji-ho frowned slightly and looked in that direction, then smiled in his heart. He knew that the person next to him with a terrifying family background was actually very afraid of the Thai family. Otherwise, there was no way he wouldn't have chased after them earlier. It was just that he didn't dare to offend the person next to him, and at the same time, he was also grateful that the other party had specially come to the capital's West Street to pick him up today, so he still just smiled and said nothing. Those people's fathers were all big businessmen, so it's okay to offend them. But in the end, you shouldn't have ignored the people in that car and just left. On the quiet night road of Gwangdu, the black car drove steadily like a ghost. The girl in red in the passenger seat stared blankly at the lights outside the front window and suddenly opened her mouth to speak. Sulu didn't respond. He knew that since the other party had spoken, she definitely had to explain something to him. Zoe turned her head and looked at Sulu with a somewhat complicated gaze. It was rare for her to be kind and said, "Those people don't know, but I do." In the blue sports car sat the seventh son of the Li family, Li Xiaotong. The Li family of the 7 great families. Yes. After a moment of silence, Sulu said, "I suddenly feel that those big shots who should have been in the clouds, the mysterious class, why is it so easy for me to see them now?" Zhou looked at him with slight ridicule and said, "You are lucky to have met Tai Yuan. Naturally, you will be further and further away from the world you originally lived in." Su Lu didn't answer this question. He thought silently. In fact, before he met Tai Yuan, he had already met the little girl of the Zhong family of the 7 great families. No matter how he looked at it, the real reason that changed his life and brought him closer and closer to those legendary families was the uncle and the chip in his neck. Li Xiaotong is the nephew of the head of the Li family. In the younger generation, according to age, he is ranked 7th. He is not a guy with a good character. Today's racing bet, he already gave me enough face. In the end, he only asked you to drink a cup. It's rare that he was so reasonable. In the end, you just walked away like that. In the Federation, there are some people and some families that you can't offend. Considering your relationship with Tai Yuan, I have to remind you. Thank you. Su Li's "thank you" was very natural and sincere. Since the other party was a member of the 7 great families, and nobody like him could only hide far away. Even if he knew Tai Yuan, it was still the same. The relationship between friends and blood was so strong that it didn't take too long to come to an answer. Actually, drinking a cup of wine is nothing. I just don't want them to see my face, Sulu said. And the most important thing is that you can't drive after drinking. The night of early spring gradually cooled down like water. Zoe tightened the short red windbreaker on her body. Sulu increased the temperature in the car. She lowered her head and thought for a moment. She looked at Sulu's side profile in the driver's seat. She looked at this guy who was not very old, but his temperament and reaction were different from his peers. She suddenly said, I don't know you very well, but I know that you are a person who doesn't like to get into trouble. In the two conflicts in Linhai, Sulu had been forced to fight back. In fact, he had never wanted to take the initiative to get into trouble. For the sake of the child in your belly, I don't want to get into trouble. Sulu's expression was a bit ugly. But then he remembered that she was pregnant, so he changed the topic. Since the other party is a member of the 7 great families, they must know something about the Tai family. If they guessed that this car belonged to Tai Yuan, they might think that someone from the Tai family was in the car. The current situation is too sensitive. In order to avoid angering too many people, they definitely wouldn't dare to investigate this car. The assassination in Linhai Gymnasium embarrassed the Federation government. In the end, it ended with the suicide of a Deputy Minister of National Defense and 7 officers of the 2nd Military Region. During such a sensitive time period, if someone tried to secretly investigate the core of the Tai family, it would definitely alarm many people. Zoe looked at him with a bit of surprise. Madam and I talked about you. We were both very grateful, or rather surprised, by your performance in the gymnasium, but I thought that you were a rare person who was overflowing with a sense of justice. I didn't expect that you would think about these things. Sulu remained silent. He didn't answer the question of overflowing because this wasn't the first time he heard it. Many years ago, he became an orphan. Together with Li Wei and the others, he had to survive in the complicated environment of Zhonglo Street. Therefore, he still retained some of his sensitivity towards the current situation. But he didn't know why, but in such a dangerous environment, his heart became clearer and clearer. Perhaps it was because of the death of his parents and younger sister, but Sulu understood life, death, and wealth better than ordinary people. Therefore, he was calmer and his mind cleaner. He was like an opaque rock that wouldn't leave a mark after being washed by water, and wouldn't leave a speck of dust behind. This kind of person who didn't have any greed for the world and wanted very little would naturally be able to defend his outlook on life. There was no need for him to compromise too much. He could be strong and not be afraid of being broken. Among the group of orphans, there were many people who could see things clearly. Li Wei also understood it, but it was a different kind of understanding. Therefore, during those years, Li Wei was very ruthless to others and to himself. Sulu believed that Li Wei, who had been in prison for a whole year, would definitely be able to get out in the future. However, he didn't know how he was doing now. Because of Su Li's silence, Zuyuk sensed something and looked at him curiously. She knew that this guy was confident that those people wouldn't dare to investigate who he was. Deep down, he was not afraid of the 7 great families. This kind of fearlessness was not referring to his ability, but his attitude. This kind of attitude was like the edge of a stone, making people feel a bit solemn. You're pregnant, so don't drink. Sulu turned his head to look at her. Under the dim light, the girl in red looked tired, her eyebrows relaxed, and her right hand gently stroking her abdomen. This picture immediately turned him from a stone into an incomparably wordy auntie. Chapter 159. I can see that you're still a traitor in your bones. That's why you have a pitiful natural hatred for those in the Federation who have wealth and power. Zoyu gently stroked her lower abdomen. Not only was the bump there not obvious, but it was also impossible to see anything at all. That was why she didn't know how Sulu could tell that she was pregnant. Right now, her words were mostly used to cover up her slight panic. Su Li's eyes were too sharp. He had been immersed in the world of metal circuits with Uncle Feng Yu for many years. Especially after he cultivated that mysterious power in his body, his eyes were even sharper. Even a difference of less than a millimeter would never escape his eyes. A human's body was obviously different from a machine's. However, a mechanic's bold guess and careful verification of the characteristics of his profession allowed him to successfully guess Zhou Yu's secret. The black car drove on the quiet streets of Huangdu. For a moment, the two of them were silent. After all, they weren't familiar with each other. In fact, they even hated each other in the past. It was even more difficult to find a topic to talk about compared to looking for pear blossoms in the winter snow of Linhai. After a moment of silence, Zhu indifferently asked about Tai Ziyuan's current situation. Su Lu remembered that this girl in red had asked him once before. However, he still calmly answered because he could see that her indifference was fake. He noticed that Zhou Yu still didn't ask for that person's name after hesitating for a long time. He said, Shi Qinghai is currently being secretly pursued by the Federation Investigation Bureau. However, he should be fine. As for where he is right now, I really don't know. Hearing the three words Shi Qinghai, Zhu Yu knew that the man beside her had guessed her thoughts. A trace of anger flashed across her slightly pale cheeks. She deliberately made a few traces of harshness in the corner of her beautiful eyes. She lightly mocked, "Scourges live for thousands of years. It's not easy for a bitch like your friend to die. From your perspective, it's better for him to be alive. You can't let the child in your womb be born without a father," Su Lu replied. Su Lu had already guessed that the father of the fetus in Zhou Yu's belly was Shi Qinghai. Although Zhou Yu did not understand the reason, she knew that he had already guessed it. However, this sentence really opened up the matter. The red-clothed girl's heart felt as if it had been rubbed by the snowflakes by the Rose River. She felt a little sour, a little painful, and a little angry. In the past few months, her mood had been very low, but the reason for this was very complicated. She had been looking forward to the Double Moon Festival Ball for a long time. In the end, it ended in a farce between Su Lu and Zhang Xiaomeng. She felt humiliated and deeply sad, but after that, she realized that besides being sad and disappointed, there was also a sense of relief. Her father, Zhou Yingxing, was directly promoted from the position of the Ministry of Defense's Logistics Department to the position of Deputy Minister. From this, it seemed that the Tai family still did not stop supporting the Zhou family because of what happened at the ball. On the contrary, their support for the Zhou family increased. Was this compensation? Sometimes, she would sneer and think that what really made her mood fall to the bottom was the news of her pregnancy. Her period had not arrived, and the color of the pregnancy test paper had changed. This made her mood change, and she began to feel frustrated and helpless. From the moment she found out that she was pregnant, she knew who the father of the child was. That beautiful face with a mean smile and that pair of peach blossom eyes would occasionally appear in her imagination and dreams. However, when she found out that the rogue official who had slapped her and had a one-night stand with her had caused her to have a child, she could not accept this reality for a while. Lady Tai still occasionally invited her to have afternoon tea together. Her father and brother still believed that she would definitely become Tai Ziyuan's partner in the future. Over the years, Zhu had been influenced by what she had seen and heard. She had always thought of herself as Tai Ziyuan's wife. Now that she was pregnant with another man's child, she actually felt a strange sense of shame and panic. She was like a girl who had been caught red-handed with the most concrete evidence. That cold, proud, and ruthless woman in red was only her disguise. The real her was a young girl who had not yet reached 20 years of age. Under such circumstances, she could no longer bear the burden. Before her family found out that she was pregnant, she had a big argument with her father and brother. She took the opportunity to move out and began to fool around with her peers in the upper circle of the Federation. She seemed to be crazy, but in reality, she was extremely frightened. She drove the fastest car, drank the strongest alcohol, and became increasingly crazy because she didn't know how to face her belly that was about to bulge. She really couldn't bear to kill the little life in her belly. Sometimes, she would be in a daze and think of the man with the pair of peach blossom eyes. However, if the situation continued to develop, it would be a problem. Perhaps subconsciously, she had some kind of self-destructive thought. Whether it was racing or drinking, they were all methods to destroy her life or the little life in her belly. Earlier, when those people saw me get in your car, they did not find it strange. Because in their eyes, maybe I am a very loose woman. Zoeyu's face was pale, but she had a strong self-deprecating smile. Looking at the dark street outside the car window, she did not know where this car was going under the guidance of the electronic map. Her slightly dry lips moved slightly, and she said indifferently, "I did not expect that hooligan Shi Qinghai would tell you about what happened between us that night. This is very tasteless. But I have a lot of men, and I don't even know who the father of the child in my belly is. If you think that the father is your friend, and that is why you pestered me tonight, then you can stop the car now." Sulu did not stop the car, nor did he turn his head to look at her with a very deep gaze to make her yield. He just looked at the front of the car and said slowly, "I don't know what your reputation is like outside. Even if it is, it should be something that happened recently. The existence of Lady Tai, Tai Ziyuan, and your family all guarantee that you are not a girl who casually has relations with others. I am Shi Qinghai's brother. I know that guy is indeed a hooligan, but there are really too few women who can resist his charm. Also, I happen to know that you two used to be together. I heard Tai Ziyuan talk about you before. I even know that when you two were in school together, there was that heavy truck accident that happened on the school street. Speaking of which, Tai Ziyuan has always felt guilty towards you. He continued, he has always treated you as a childhood friend. Trust me, even if the Tai family knew that you were together with another man, they would not express too strongly. At most, Lady Tai would be a bit disappointed." Thinking about what Tai Ziyuan had said that day, Sulu could not help but turn his head and glance at Zoeyu's beautiful waist and butt. He thought that in the eyes of that lady, the most important thing about such a wonderful body was that it would be easy to give birth. It had to be said that the lady's taste was indeed very unique. Shi Qinghai and the girl in red next to him had only been together once, but the girl had already given birth to a baby. On one hand, it showed that Shi Qinghai was very capable. On the other hand, it also showed that the Zhou family's eldest daughter was indeed. Zoeyu thought about the accident that happened when she was young, and her expression changed slightly. Then, she thought about the huge situation that she was in right now, and her face gradually turned pale. Her eyes saw a pack of cigarettes in front of the car, and she could not help but frown. She subconsciously took out a cigarette, and with trembling fingers, she lit the lighter. In the high-end apartment in Linhai City, the man with the pair of peach blossom eyes had this brand of cigarettes in his house. Su Li's smoking habit was basically cultivated by Shi Qinghai, so the cigarettes that he was used to smoking now were also of this brand. She only took a puff, and before the smoke could leave her red lips, the red light at the tip of the cigarette flashed slightly, and a hand reached out from the side and rudely snatched the cigarette away. Zoeyu was very angry, and the smoke in her mouth rushed into her mouth, and she coughed. Sulu said quietly, "Pregnant people should not smoke, drink, and drive fast in the future. Pregnant person, child, father." Although Sulu didn't do it on purpose, these words had been repeated several times during this journey that seemed to have no destination. They drilled into Zoeyu's ears and stimulated her mood. She finally couldn't hold it in anymore. With a gloomy face, she shouted loudly, "Shut up. What does this have to do with you? At this time, the black car had just driven to a quiet side door of Linyuan. There were faint lights in the distance, but it was very quiet, and only the sound of forest insects and grass frogs could be heard. Above their heads, there were stars, and 2 moons hung on the 2 ends of the dark sky, which was very beautiful. The reason why I was angry just now was because of you. This has nothing to do with me, but the child in your belly has something to do with me. Su stared into her eyes and said, maybe you don't want to accept this life, but this is not your problem alone. I can't watch you drink and drive fast, and in the end, lose your life and the life in your belly. Don't forget, the child's father is my best friend, so of course I can't allow you to do this. Zhou was so angry that she laughed, and said with a cold smile, even if someone has to take care of this, it should be Shi Qinghai, that hooligan. You have no right to say anything. Su paused, and then slightly lowered his head and said, this is indeed unfair to you, but Shi Qinghai is in a very dangerous situation right now. Under the circumstances that he doesn't know, if you choose not to have this child, it would be too unfair to him. I'm sorry, but after all, I am his best friend. Now you have 2 choices. One is to abort this child, and then hide this matter forever. But, now that I know, it will be very difficult for you to hide it from the whole world. Are you threatening me? How can you be so shameless? Zhou stared into his eyes in disbelief. Su lowered his head even more. He had been thinking about this problem all along the way, but after thinking about it for a long time, he could only choose to use this kind of shameless method to threaten a girl who was naturally in a vulnerable position. This was not a kind way to deal with it, and it was not in line with his character, but it was definitely in line with the logic of an orphan in Donglin. In the eyes of orphans like him, there were many things that were most important. Chapter 160. I'm sorry. Su raised his head and expressed his apology very seriously. Wengdu Hospital is inside Linyuan. If you don't want this child, I can send you there right now. And then you'll tell the Tai family or my father about this. Zhou looked at him as if she wanted to eat him alive. Or you can choose the second option and give birth to the child. I'll take care of you during your pregnancy. Su thought for a moment and said very seriously, actually, you've been hesitating. Otherwise, you wouldn't have used alcohol and racing to try to cause some kind of accident. Since you also cherish the child in your belly, why don't you try to give birth to it? Give birth to it. What will happen after it's born? Zhou looked at Su with a pale face and said sadly. In the social environment of the Federation, there were many single mothers. Moreover, there was social assistance, so they rarely faced superficial discrimination. However, the problem was that Zhou was not the daughter of an ordinary family. I'll think of a way to find Shi Qinghai. After saying this, Su got out of the car and left Zhou alone in the car to make the most difficult choice. He quietly leaned against the heavy car door, lit up Mr. Shi's favorite cigarette, and took a deep breath. Shi Qinghai was his brother. He was an orphan and a fugitive pursued by the Federation government. He was in deep water and doing business on the edge of a knife. He might die silently one day. Su had been worried about him all this time. Now, unexpectedly, he found out that Shi Qinghai actually had an unborn child and a descendant. Su was very moved. He really wanted Shi Qinghai's child to survive. As an orphan, he cherished his descendants more than most people in the Federation. He didn't want Mr. Shi to die without any descendants. It was this strong feeling that made him follow Zhou all the way to the entrance of Qingshan Park and have a conflict with those people. Therefore, he wanted to threaten Zhou. In fact, if the daughter of the Zhou family in the car really chose to have an abortion, he would only hide this matter in the bottom of his heart forever. The two people inside and outside the car quietly looked at the lights of Wangdu Hospital in the distance. In the time it took to smoke a cigarette, they both made up their minds. Zhou Yu did not get out of the car, which meant that she had made a decision. If I really didn't want this child, I think you probably wouldn't have spread this matter to everyone, Zhou Yu said coldly without looking at him as she gently fiddled with the slightly damp hair on her forehead. After a moment of silence, Su Le nodded and said, in the end, it's still you who can't bear to part with this child. Zhou Yu's eyes were no longer as charming as usual. Instead, they were much softer. She didn't know what she was reluctant to part with. Her first man had died a long time ago. Although the case had never been solved, she knew that the male student, whom she didn't like very much, had actually died under the gun of her own brother. In fact, before she knew she was pregnant, she already had the existence of that beautiful man in her mind. Through her family's channels, she also knew that he was a spy for the anti-government army and was currently wanted by the Federation government. This was very good. At least she didn't have to worry about whether or not that hooligan would be killed by the army sent by her family. He probably wouldn't have any way to survive in the Federation. Zhou Yu laughed softly. Her laughter was filled with loneliness and mockery. She turned her head and looked at Su Le with a very strange gaze. She said softly, since you think you're his good brother and want to participate in this matter, then if there's any trouble in the future, you'll have to shoulder it. The girl in red, Zhou Yu, was the incomparably pampered daughter of the Minister of National Defense, Zhou Yingxing. She was the younger generation that even the madam of the Tai family liked very much. Regardless of whether she ran away from home or refused to return in a fit of pique, as time passed, the news of her pregnancy could not be hidden forever. When the time came, whether it was the Zhou family or the Tai family, they would probably ask who the child's father was. Shi Qinghai continued to be his spy and was being chased by the Federation. Naturally, it was impossible for him to be the child's father. Although this was the truth was often the most troublesome. At this moment, Zhou Yu's words with a cold smile were equivalent to giving Su Le a difficult problem. If he wanted to interfere in this matter, how could he withstand the pressure? At this moment, the car had already started moving slowly. It left the beautiful nighttime Linyuan of Wangdu Hospital and headed in the direction of the highway. Su Li's hands were placed steadily on the steering wheel. It seemed that his shoulders weren't very broad and solid. She didn't know if he could carry it. He didn't answer Zhou Yu's question because he was used to doing rather than talking. Since he had already chosen to protect Shi Qinghai's child, there were some troubles that had to be faced. The black car had not yet reached the highway intersection. Zhou Yu seemed to be a little unaccustomed to the silence in the car. She frowned and asked, "Where do you live?" "Wangdu." "What are you doing in the capital?" "Work." "What work?" "I just joined the Shell Motor Company's spring recruitment today. I should be entering the research institute." Hearing this answer, Zhou Yu's eyes flashed with a hint of surprise. Her family had always been in the military system, so she naturally knew the requirements of the Shell Motor Company. In particular, she felt a trace of surprise and a little admiration for this inconspicuous guy beside her who could actually enter the research institute. But in the blink of an eye, the surprise in her eyes turned into a somewhat strange smile. Su Le was a taciturn fellow, but his brain was actually pretty good. When he heard Zhou Yu's question, he knew that the other party was going to give him another difficult question. However, he only gave a faint smile, not minding it at all. After all, it was only right to do something for a friend. An engineer from the Shell Motor Company. Although this identity can't be approved by my family, at least it doesn't sound too bad. Zhou Yu looked at him with a faint smile. Su Le smiled and said, "I'm afraid this kind of trick won't be able to fool your family. That's why I'm not going back to the special region today. I'm going to your house." After Zhou Yu said this, her whole body relaxed. She leaned against the very comfortable driver's seat and squinted her eyes to look at the silent night outside the window. Sulu hesitated for a moment and directly replied, "Okay." Such a clean and decisive response made Zoyu feel surprised again. She stared blankly at Su Li's side profile. She didn't understand why this guy who she didn't know was willing to do this. Could it really be because of the father of the child in her belly? But didn't he know that doing this would cause a lot of trouble? Think carefully. This isn't some romantic movie, she said with a cold smile. Sulu paused for a moment and smiled. He thought to himself that he was just a little hot-blooded, not melodramatic. The moment he hesitated before answering, he had already sorted out all the problems. He didn't care about the small troubles that might occur in the future. He also didn't care about the misunderstanding between friends and the possibility of an irreversible plot. Whether it was Shi Qinghai or Tai Yuan, they were all very rational and calm people. Their IQs were not lower than 70. The child in the belly of the girl beside him had to be alive. Mr. Shi had to have a descendant. The whole thing was that simple. After the child is born, let me be the godfather, Sulu said. Zoyu looked at him with a complicated expression. She felt that she couldn't understand this ordinary guy. What kind of experience did he have to grow up to be such a person? On a flat area about 7 kilometers away from the 3rd recruit base of the Ministry of National Defense, a few black cars were parked on a flat area under the hill. It was early spring, but the place was still very cold. Tai Yuan tightened his windbreaker. He looked at the silhouette of the military base in the distance and couldn't help but take a deep breath. His eyes were still calm, but they started to show a sense of determination. According to the original plan, he would use a year to finish his studies at Yue University before entering the Silan military district. He would throw himself into the front lines of the battle against the Empire's border troops, laying a solid foundation for his destined extraordinary life. At the very least, he would need to complete the blank part of the military. However, after the assassination in Linhai State, Tai Yuan changed the location of his military service from the West Woods military district to the S2 region, near the 4 states of Green Dragon Mountain. This decision was made by him alone. Other than his wife, not many people could understand his thoughts. At this time, the phone rang. Tai Yuan looked at the caller ID and couldn't help but smile. He hadn't received a call from that guy for many days. He didn't know how his recruitment exam in the capital was going. He was very clear about his abilities, so he wasn't worried and didn't think of calling. Through the phone, the expression on Tai Yuan's thin and pale face changed slightly. He was a little shocked, a little angry, and a little surprised. In the end, it turned into a bitter smile. After hanging up the phone, he was silent for a long time. He was very satisfied with Su Li's call. He was very shocked about the news of Yuzi's pregnancy. He was a little angry about the true identity of the child's father. This was a kind of anger that only men could understand. Although Tai Yuan didn't think about having anything with Zoyu, he still felt down when he found out that the girl in red who always liked him suddenly had a child with that rogue spy. If it wasn't for Su Lu running back to Linhai, that person called Shi Qinghai would have died. Maybe it would have been better. Tai Yuan thought silently. Then, he handed the phone to Butler Jean, who had been quietly waiting behind him, and said slowly, "If Su Lu calls, there are some things that I need your help with." "Yes, young master," Butler Jean answered quietly. Tai Yuan took his luggage from the car and carried it on his back. Under the gazes of the 10 or so core members of the Tai family, he walked along the mountain road and headed towards the military base in the distance. After walking for a long time, he waved his hand and flagged down a bus that was passing through the military base. Butler Jean silently watched his gradually disappearing figure. His heart was filled with mixed feelings. Young master finally took his first step. It was just that he had to hide his identity and work hard at the bottom of the second military region. Who knew how much pain he would have to go through? The bus stopped beside Tai Yuan. The driver, who was smoking a cigarette, looked at him with an unfriendly expression and asked loudly, "New melon?" Chapter 161. When the bus disappeared at the end of the road, Butler Jean retracted his worried gaze and boarded the bus with more than 10 members of the Tai family. In the car, the white-haired old man closed his eyes and began to recuperate. In name, he was Tai Yuan's personal butler, but in reality, he had a lot of power in his hands. There were several groups that were directly responsible to him. At this moment, the old man had a feeling of depression and anxiety that he couldn't get rid of. However, there was also a faint sense of pride. These feelings were all because of Tai Yuan's choice. Maybe history will judge me to be wrong, but I will never admit that I was wrong. On the night when Tai Yuan decided to join the second military region instead of going to the front lines in the West Woods, he smiled and said this in front of Lady Tai and Butler Jean. This was the confession of the Deputy Minister of National Defense, Yang Jingsong, before he died. Because of the Linhai State Gymnasium incident, 7 officers from the second military region committed suicide. The Deputy Minister of National Defense also committed suicide. Although the entire Federation was very satisfied with the agreement between Representative Pobre and Green Dragon Mountain, within the military, there were still some unfriendly feelings towards the Tai family. Even though Tai Yuan knew that it was a dangerous place, he still insisted on going there. On one hand, as the successor of the Tai family, he really admired those soldiers who tried to assassinate him. On the other hand, he knew very well that only by being in the same position for a few years could the soldiers of the second military region truly resolve their resentment towards the Tai family. He would definitely step onto the political stage in the future, so he had to resolve the issue with the second military region very well. Without a doubt, this was a very risky decision. That was why the wrinkles beside Butler Jin's tightly shut eyes showed his worry. After a while, he slowly opened his eyes and looked at the phone in his hand with a gaze that seemed to be able to see through people's thoughts. He thought about the call that his young master received before he left and frowned. The call was from Su Lu. Butler Jean had no idea that Zhou Yu was pregnant. All he could think about was Su Lu, the seemingly ordinary young man. From the old man's point of view, Su Lu had always possessed a kind of craftiness or intuition that belonged to the lower class. This ability had always been hidden under that calm and sincere face, which made the old man feel a little uneasy. Being the young master's friend would definitely bring more benefits than being his subordinate. This was not a difficult question, but very few people could see it clearly and dared to bet on it. Spring in the capital special district was so gentle. Whether it was the wind on the streets, the rain in the afternoon, the sun at dusk, or the flowers that were just beginning to stretch their waists, they were all moving slowly and delicately, without a hint of wild enthusiasm. A black car with an ordinary license plate without a logo slowly moved along the streets. In the driver's seat, Su Lu, who was wearing a military uniform, squinted his eyes and observed the capital streets outside the car window. He saw many buildings that he had only seen in postcards. These buildings were of different styles, but they all exuded a faint sense of solemnity. This was the core political district of the Human Federation for tens of thousands of years. It seemed that every brick and every metal wall reflected the light of history and glory, and breathed in the aura of authority and solemnity. When he was mixing in with the orphans in the Donglin district, Su Lu never thought that his life's dream would come true one day. He could actually drive a car and slowly drive in the most central district of the Human Federation, and he was also one of these people. However, after his dream became reality, his original dream had already changed. The goal he was looking for was no longer the same as it was in the beginning. A faint sense of oppression enveloped his heart, making his breathing a little uncomfortable. Subconsciously, he tugged at the button on his collar. It had been a few days, but he still hadn't gotten used to the military uniform he was wearing. After a day of training at the Shell Motor Company, he became an official staff member of the Shell Motor Corporation Research Institute. However, he didn't expect that after entering the Federation, he would have to take on a military position. Although it was only a civilian officer, he was under the dual management of the company and the Ministry of Defense. Today, Sulo was already a first lieutenant in the Federation. Life was really a wonderful thing. Back then, passing the mechanic officer exam of the Ministry of Defense or joining the Shell Motor Company were two of Su Lee's dreams. Now, it seemed that in a sense, he had realized these two dreams at the same time. However, because of the death of Uncle Fengyu, Zhang Xiaoming's death, and many other things that happened after that, he had long lost his initial yearning and respect for the Federation government and the military. Following Hawking Avenue and bypassing the thick and cold building of the Ministry of Finance, the black car drove toward the northern suburbs of the capital. When it passed by an extremely quiet intersection, Su Lee's eyes narrowed. His pupils contracted slightly, but he didn't slow down the speed of the car in the slightest. It was a road that was rumored to have no exits. At the end of the road was the mysterious Bureau of Proclamation. The sign at the intersection didn't say anything, only a few lines of warning and control. The back of Su Lee's neck went slightly numb at this moment, as if there was a chill rising from his heart. His brows furrowed, and he mobilized the scorching heat in his body to circulate around his body, driving the chill out. He knew that it wasn't that something had happened to his chip at this moment and that the omnipotent central computer of the Bureau of Proclamation had discovered something. It was the greatest fear in his heart that made it difficult for him to calm down. The mysterious Bureau of Proclamation was the existence that Sulu feared the most in the Federation. However, he also felt that one day, he would drive a car along that road that had no exits and have some sort of relationship with the Bureau of Proclamation. The car with a pass on it easily passed through the entrance control of the first military academy of the Federation. It went around the quiet passageway beside the Lotus Pond and passed through 2 checks before arriving at the 3rd department of the Shell Motor Company Research Institute. When Sulu first came to the Research Institute, he also felt that it was a bit strange. He didn't expect the 3rd department of the Shell Motor Company Research Institute to be located on the campus of the 1st Military Academy. Later, he gradually understood that the Husk Institute was a very liberal department. The main research topics were all research and development with well-known professors from various universities. Therefore, the Shell Motor Company simply set up a few research institute branches in various universities to facilitate the work of the old professors. It was also because of this reason that the Federation government required the staff in the Research Institute to be transferred to military positions in order to strengthen their control of this area. Of course, the old professors were excluded. Walking from the parking lot to the quiet building, the contact between the insulating material floor and the soles of the military boots made monotonous sounds. Sulu took a piece of bread and ate it as he walked towards his own area. In the long corridor, he only met 2 colleagues. They just nodded and greeted each other before leaving. The Research Institute of the Shell Motor Company gathered the top talents in the entire Federation. Excellent scholars and experts could be found everywhere. In the most important department of the Federation, all the staff were focused on their own research. Therefore, the usual greetings were extremely rare. In the past 10 days, Sulu had already gotten used to this kind of atmosphere. Coincidentally, he was also a person who was as quiet as gold, so he actually liked it. However, he didn't notice that the 2 researchers who walked past him turned around and looked at him with sympathy in their eyes. He took out the electronic door card and opened the heavy door. In front of the second door, his whole body was scanned by a light blue light, especially by the chip. After his access was approved, the real door opened. A large operation room that looked like a warehouse appeared in front of Su Lee's eyes. From the most precise bald head tools to the largest alloy cutting equipment, from the Federation's most powerful processor to a storage device that was about the size of 3 bookshelves and stored a large amount of blueprints and data, everything that appeared in front of Su Li's eyes was completely in line with his life's ideals. However, he didn't know why, but there wasn't a trace of excitement on his face. Instead, there was a faint sense of tiredness. The equipment was covered in a layer of dust. The images displayed on the holographic screen on the table were constantly changing. The faint sound of electrical current in the storage device was so beautiful. Su Li stared blankly at all this and couldn't help but smile bitterly. The automatic dust removal device hadn't been used for a long time. The equipment in this warehouse was so expensive, but it was placed so casually. Su Li shook his head. If he had enough time, relying on the manufacturing equipment, data, and materials here, he was even confident that he could assemble a mecha. However, he didn't have the time to do this. He didn't even have the time to clean this room. Pulling out a piece of paper, he wiped the table and carefully placed the remaining half of the bread on the clean table. Su Li took off his military uniform and threw it on a chair. Then, as if warming up before a fight, he moved his neck and the joints of his hands. Taking a deep breath, he squatted in front of the table and stared at the image on the table. The display terminal of the warehouse's computer was on this table. It was about 1 meter wide and 2.5 meters long. The image on the screen rotated slowly, giving people a very comfortable visual enjoyment. However, Su Li was as cautious as if he was facing the cruelest enemy in his life. Right at this moment, an old and calm voice rang out in the warehouse. It was calm but spoke quickly. This voice didn't greet Su Li and directly issued a work order. Second, 3 sets of incompatible data. Laser state transition diagram. QED data. A dozen orders were issued in a row. Su Li listened in silence. His hands had already begun to move quickly on the table. From the massive amount of data in the internal memory, he found an entry that matched the requirements. However, because the data requested by the voice was final data, the fields involved were the most cutting-edge fields in the Federation's scientific community that hadn't matured yet, so there was no ready-made data. He looked for suitable mathematical tools, borrowed the computer's powerful computing power, and summarized the data. According to the other party's request, he carried out the final image process. In other words, Su Li's current job was to use the shortest amount of time to convert the complex data system into simple data support that could be easily used to draw conclusions. Half an hour later, Su Li finally finished the first task. His fingertips pressed the light block on the table and sent the result over. However, he didn't even have time to wipe the sweat off his forehead before he immediately started the second task. From the first day he entered the research institute, Su Li was engaged in this kind of boring work. He finally understood why the research institute suddenly had the idea of snatching people from the shell spring recruitment. This kind of research processing role was really not easy. Even with Su Li's physical strength and brain power, he almost couldn't handle it. The owner of the old voice wasn't Professor Shin, who went to the Shell Motor Company to snatch people. It was Professor Shin's father. An old monster who was respectfully called Old Shin by the Research Institute staff. An old monster. Only Old Shin and Su Li were in this storage room of the 3rd Division of the Research Institute. It was said that during the peak of the research period, there were a total of more than 10 research assistants in this storage room. However, in the end, not a single one of them was able to persevere. They all requested to be transferred away. A few of them even resigned to go through strict military scrutiny to leave the Husk Institute. Su Li mechanically and numbly organized the data, but his mind was thinking about other things. He knew that Professor Shin's research direction was in the field of quantum measurable dynamics. The problem was that all the experts in the Federation agreed that this was a dead end. There would never be an exit, just like the special road that led to the Bureau of Proclamation. There was no time to research the chip, to come into contact with the Federation's most mysterious charter technology. He couldn't even personally touch the mechanical aspects of mecha battleships. All day long, he was faced with this vague data that he couldn't even understand. Accompanying an eccentric old professor to research something that would never yield results. Su-lo suddenly had doubts about his own choice. Chapter 162. In the past, Su-lo had spent a lot of time in the library of Yue University, reading all kinds of books and unofficial historical commentaries, so he was able to recognize the faces of a few old men from the Federation. These top figures in the scientific and cultural field of the Federation were either honorary directors in some institute or were worshipped like ancestors in some university. Electronic gossip magazines loved to write about people, especially celebrities, such as Jian Shuier, certain politicians, and that mature female anchor on the news channel of the Federation. The academic gossip magazines that were subsidized by the education fund of the Federation actually had the same hobby. However, the words "wrong" in the "wrong" were all removed. They just blindly grabbed idols from the ivory tower to attract the ordinary readers who were fascinated by the mysterious and unknown scientific cult. The older the idols, the better. Just smearing gold dust on these old scholars was probably not enough to satisfy the peeping desire of the Federation citizens. Therefore, the biographical articles in the academic journals always described these old men as strange people. No matter whether these old men were historians or astrophysicists, in these articles, they were all old fools who were cooked in a pot and walked around like ghosts. The old professor that Su-lo was following now had the surname Professor Shen and the name Yufei. It was the name of a typical gigolo. However, he knew that Professor Shen was not a gigolo. In the past 10 days, he had met this old professor 3 times. Su-lo faintly felt that this old professor looked familiar. It was only later that he remembered that he had seen this old man's picture in several academic journals. He had also read the related biographies. Su-lo had never believed that these top old scholars in the Federation were all strange people. In his opinion, the scholars who could be in these academic journals were definitely experts. Although he was an unorthodox engineer, he respected these old men very much. He even faintly admired them. Today, when he was next to these top experts in the Federation, he was shocked to find that the non-academic biographies in the academic journals were not all fake. The old men's temperament was indeed a bit strange. In the past, when he looked at them from afar, he could see that they were strange mountains and rocks. Now that he was close to them, he realized that they were actually difficult mountain roads. In the main research and control room, Su-lo would always be busy for a long time. He did not have time to do what he wanted to do. Those difficult theories were things that he could not fully understand at the moment. He needed to retrieve data and diagrams, as well as search for related information in the vast literature library. For the current him, it was very difficult work. There was no creativity, and he could not come into contact with any real research topics. All he did was help. He was more like a humanoid computer sorting and sorting, not a research assistant. It was no wonder that with Professor Shen's status in the academic world, there were no other researchers in the laboratory today except for Su-lo. It was also no wonder that the young Professor Shen would so impulsively run to the spring recruitment exam site to snatch people. Presumably, the young Professor Shen was also forced into a corner by the old Professor Shen. The work that Su-lo did every day seemed simple, but in fact, it was very complicated and tiring. The most important thing was that it was boring. Just like Linhai Prefecture in the middle of winter, the 4 seasons of the Donglin region, when it snowed, it would last for several months. When the sky darkened, it would last for an entire year. There was no change at all. Fortunately, Sulu was a person who was used to silence and had a calm temperament. Like a stone, he silently and steadily completed the work that the old professor gave him in front of the holographic screen table. Even though there were occasional feelings of disappointment in his heart, they disappeared in the blink of an eye. He didn't complain, and he didn't even think about leaving the research institute. To be honest, the staff he had seen in the past 10 days were less than the stray cats he had seen in the Donglin district's mine. Even if he wanted to complain, he couldn't find a suitable target. He washed the hair of the Zhong family's daughter, took a bullet for the young master of the Tai family, and scared the young master of the Li family with his car. At this time, in Su Li's eyes, the 7 most mysterious and powerful families of the Federation no longer had any halos. Environment and experience were the most difficult to change a person's mind. At this time, Su Lu was very sure that he was not an ordinary person, but he also knew that in addition to the chip and the tyrannical mysterious power in his body, his biggest reliance was the technology in his brain. And to understand these 3 things, even Tai Xuan could not help much. It was still that old saying, only technology could get close to technology. Sulu knew very well that this old Professor Shen Yufei definitely would not set these difficult questions to test him just because he liked him too much. Then, one day, there would be a golden flash and the old professor would pass on his entire legacy to him, and then die. This was not a dream, this was a wet dream in the military camp, an obscene fantasy that deserved a beating. He was only sure that if he wanted to get close to the core technology of the Federation, he would need to stay by this old professor's side and follow these old gentlemen. Just bear with it for now, Sulu thought in his heart, but the speed of his hands did not slow down at all. Looking at his 10 fingers that were about to become afterimages before his eyes, he subconsciously began to daydream. He thought to himself that if he had to bear with this for another half a year, when he was operating a mecha in the future, his hand speed would really be amazing. This boring assistant job actually did have some benefits. As for what the hell the hand speed had to do with mecha, of course that only existed in Su Li's daydreaming. The benefit he could clearly feel was that he was already becoming more and more familiar with handling this massive and complex database. He believed that in another 2 months' time, this database would be like those components piled up in the operations room of the mine. No matter how complicated the process was, it would not be a problem for him. Professor Shen's research on quantum measurable dynamics was too cutting-edge, so much so that it was publicly acknowledged that there was no future for it. However, precisely because there was no future for it, the data required encompassed many aspects. It was like a blind cat trying to kill a mouse. It would definitely be blindly bumping around on a 2-dimensional plane at 360 degrees. The 3 divisions of the Research Institute were set up in the first military academy and shared the same database. Professor Shen's position, as well as the 360 degrees of blindly bumping around that position, was enough for him to enter most of the areas. As the only assistant, Su Lu could already faintly see the shape of a treasure mountain, shining brightly. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the Research Institute got off work punctually. There were still many researchers who had not completed their research projects, so they would still remain in their own labs. However, Sulu had already packed up his belongings neatly, put on his military cap, typed his farewells on the desktop, and left the storage room immediately. Before he left, he glanced at the row of Federation cutting-edge equipment covered in fine dust and could not help but sigh. He thought to himself that he would definitely find some time tomorrow to come out and fix the dust removal equipment. It was fine as long as he completed his own work. There was no need to spend all his time with that old man. Sulu would leave punctually every day. In fact, he had also thought that if he could work overtime here, he might really be able to find something after Professor Shen left. However, he really did not have much time now. Not long after that black car left the first military academy, Professor Shen also walked out of the lab with the help of his crutches. He got into his son's car outside the entrance of the Research Institute. Young Professor Shen noticed that his father did not look very good, but he was not surprised. Ever since his father devoted himself to the research of quantum measurable dynamics 10 years ago, this had already become a fact that was destined to happen. Young Professor Shen could not help but sigh in his heart. With his father's status in the scientific community of the Federation and his identity as a Nebula Award winner, in the last few years of his life, he had entered a dead end. As a son and student, he was really disappointed. However, he also knew that people who engaged in scientific research were stubborn. No one could persuade each other. "Is the new assistant okay?" Young Professor Shen subconsciously asked. Many years ago, he and his father rarely talked about anything other than academic topics. "Very good." Professor Shen's eyes were half closed. His hands were pressed on the crutches. The age spots on his face were very obvious. On his soft cheeks, there were 2 patches of yellow that did not look auspicious. Young Professor Shen was slightly stunned. He did not expect that his eccentric father would give such a high evaluation of the research assistant. Although it was only 2 words, when was the last time someone received such an evaluation? Impeccable when he works. Old Professor Shen seemed to be interested. He slowly opened his somewhat cloudy eyes, coughed twice, and said regretfully, "Although I was not very familiar with the classification of subjects in the beginning, this kid is very smart and willing to work hard. The problem is that he gets off work on time every day. It makes me very unhappy. It seems that he is a person with a girlfriend. It is really stupid of him to fall in love so early and waste his time." During the spring recruitment exam in nutshell, Professor Shen Jr. had chosen Su Lo on behalf of his father at first glance. It was because of Su Li's meticulous and logical ability on the test paper, as well as the leap of thought in the last big question, as well as the extraordinary hands-on ability that Professor Zhou from Yue University had mentioned. Young Professor Shen was also very satisfied that his father was satisfied with him. However, when he heard his father's last sentence, he could not help but be silent. He thought to himself, if young people do not fall in love, what else can they do? Su Lu did not have a girlfriend. Even if he did, in his heart, she had already turned into a few balls of fire in the sky above S2. She melted into the clouds and disappeared with the wind. Now, he was naturally not in the mood to fall in love. Whether it was the problem in his body or Senator Macklin, who was in full swing with the presidential election, both made him more silent than before. The automatic thermal soup pot began to sound. Su Luk scooped out the soup and carefully placed it on the dining table. He then went to the kitchen to cook a few side dishes and 2 bowls of rice. Only then did he sit at the table and began to focus on eating. A red figure appeared in the living room. Miss So family was wearing a light red haltered top today. She looked very cool. She was a little tired as she sat across from him. She looked at the dishes in front of her and said, "You really are a person who is not afraid of trouble." The soup was made by Su Lo before he left in the morning. The dishes were bought from the supermarket the night before yesterday. Su Lo raised her head in confusion, glanced at her, and asked hesitantly, "What's the trouble? Why don't you eat the ready-made food?" Zhou Yu scooped up a chicken claw in the soup and frowned. "You can be considered a little rich now. It shouldn't be a problem for you to eat at a restaurant." Chapter 163. Speaking of synthetic meat, I've always had a question. You're now a member of the Husk Institute, so I can ask you about it. Zhou Yu looked at him and asked, "The Federation's synthetic meat fibers have been in use for many years now. Why haven't we seen any applications for them in other areas? For example, in the area of mecha linkage devices." Zhou Yu, who was wearing a red halter top, sat quietly across from Su Lo and asked seriously. In her opinion, since this ordinary-looking but eccentric young man was able to enter the most advanced research institute in the Federation, he naturally had some areas worth learning from. Su Li's fingers froze in the middle of picking up food. Only then did he remember that the girl's father was the Deputy Minister of National Defense. Although not all families of generals could produce tiger girls, they rarely produced trash. At least this question seemed ridiculous, but in reality, it was a very important matter. I've never been able to get through the ethics committee, and the most important thing is that protein cannot withstand high temperatures, and whether it's mecha or other mechanical equipment, being able to withstand high temperatures is a basic requirement. A few days ago, when he was helping Professor Shin organize some information, Su Lu had seen a few famous biochemical hybrid experiments in the 23rd constitutional calendar. In that grand experiment that lasted 40 years, countless failures proved that this idea could never become a reality. He raised his head and looked at the girl in red, or perhaps it should be called the girl in red now. Who knew how many thoughts flashed through his mind at the same time? Zhou Yu was not wearing any makeup today. Her features were more delicate, and her shoulders were exposed beyond the two thin straps. Her entire person was languid, but there was only calmness, a calmness that seeped out from her bones. She picked up the food on her plate with her chopsticks. Her movements were silent and natural. Whether she raised her hand or not, she always appeared so elegant and quiet. Su Lu looked at her, and his two knife-like eyebrows gradually rose. There was a strange look in his eyes. After these few days of interaction, he confirmed that this girl, who was not yet 20, was not as difficult to get along with as he had thought. It could even be said that she had a good upbringing. Speaking of which, how could a daughter-in-law that could be chosen by Lady Tai be a bitch with heavy makeup? Su Lu just did not understand why the Zhou Yu he saw in Lin Hai was a completely different person. She was a disgusting woman who was cold and arrogant to the extreme. He could not figure it out no matter how he thought about it. He could only sigh and admit that women were indeed the most elusive creatures in this world. It had been more than 10 days. In these 10 days, Zhou Yu had been staying in Su Li's rented apartment, watching TV and surfed the internet to kill time. Perhaps it was because of her pregnancy, but she always looked so tired. Su Lu was also a quiet person. In addition, they were not very happy to see each other, so these days, the two of them did not talk much. After being stared at by Su Lu for so long, of course Zhou Yu knew, but she did not react at all. She just obediently finished the rice in her bowl, drank the high-energy protein powder that Su Lu had prepared for her beforehand, and ate a folic acid tablet. Then she smiled at Su Lu and said, "Do I look good?" Zhou Yu did not mind being stared at. She was born beautiful, and since she was young, she had always been the center of attention. However, in the past, the unscrupulous people who dared to stare at her around the 3rd military region either had their legs broken or were thrown into the cold winter river. These past few years of life experience had turned this girl into a person who used coldness and indifference to hide her frustration. However, ever since that night, sitting in that black car and following this small-eyed boy in front of her back to this ordinary apartment, Zhou Yu suddenly realized that such a peaceful home life was not all that bad. It was just that this whole thing was really ridiculous. Zhou Yu often wondered what kind of person Su Lu was. She had seen bored men who were willing to stab themselves a few times out of loyalty to their brothers, but a man who took over everything so calmly and was not afraid of any troubles or misunderstandings was really rare. Although Su Li's eyes were small, they were often squinted, just like when he was staring at her blankly right now. Strangely, there was no coldness or harshness in those eyes, nor was there any discomforting emotion. There was only a faint smile, not sincere, but also amiable and trustworthy. Anyone who spent some time with Su Lu would fall in love with this quiet young man, and it was not the romantic type. Zhou Yu was no exception, so the words, "Do I look good?" made people feel uneasy and had a deeper meaning. "You look good." Sula nodded and said sincerely. The eldest daughter of the Zhou family, who was not wearing any makeup, was more than enough to be called beautiful. Her facial features were not suitable for heavy makeup to begin with. It was only suitable for light application. Coupled with the serenity between her eyebrows at this moment, she was even more beautiful. This answer did not surprise Zhou. Even a person who was not direct would know when to say something direct to cover up. But the problem now was that she did not understand what this seemingly ordinary young man in front of her was hiding. Or to put it more deeply, she did not even know if he was hiding anything. At the entrance of Qingshan Park, Sulo called out and knocked over a car. She followed him. Outside the Linyuan of Wangdu Hospital, Sulo smoked a cigarette outside the car. She thought about it for a while in the car and did not get out. She followed him directly to this inconspicuous apartment. Zhou believed that she was a clear-headed person. She was willing to follow Sulo, aside from some thoughts that could not be exposed in front of others, mostly because of the little life in her belly. No matter what kind of woman she was, at the moment of her first pregnancy, she would succumb to her instincts, or rather, succumb to her secreted hormones. A greater woman would have such a thing as maternal love, so they would be sentimental, sensitive, and give birth to a tigress who would not care about anything. Zhou became ruthless, so she ran away from home, washed away her lead, and hid in this apartment to prepare for the birth of her child. She had been sentimental before, so when she saw Su Li's black car on Highway 2, she would cry like a black cloud destroying a city. But now that everything had settled down temporarily, it was difficult to calm down her increasingly sensitive mind. She had her own reasons for the situation in front of her, but what about him? Was it really because the child in her belly was the descendant of his brother? Zhou sipped the sticky protein powder and frowned slightly. She did not deliberately hide the cautious gaze she shot at Su Lo. It was still the same saying. It was common to be limited by the so-called loyalty. Because of a moment of hot-bloodedness, it was rare to be able to protect someone gently for a long time, not tired of trouble, and not be disloyal. Zhou tilted her head slightly and looked at Su Lo with interest. These days, Su Lo had looked up a lot of things on the internet and took very good care of her. Whether it was cooking or washing, he did not show any reluctance or boredom. Looking at his behavior, it seemed as if he was prepared to protect her for as long as he could not find Shi Qinghai. However, at this time, both the man and woman at the table knew that it was not easy for Shi Qinghai to come back openly. Everyone had seen thunder and lightning, but no one had seen water penetrate a stone with their own eyes. The latter was obviously not easy. Therefore, Zhou was suspicious, Zhou was puzzled, and Zhou was a little depressed. I really find it hard to believe that there is someone like you in the Federation today. Zhou did not say that he was such a person, because it was difficult to express clearly in words. It was probably a positive evaluation related to morality. You women don't know much about men's affairs. Su Lu said an old saying that was not liked by feminists. He explained with a smile, in my eyes, the women of my brothers are not women. Trouble related to my brothers is not trouble. These words were not crude, and neither was the reason. However, no matter which era, there were many people who believed in these simple principles, but there were only a few men who could truly put their brothers first and not seduce their wives. Su Lu did not know what he was doing now. In a certain time and space, there was a second master who did the same thing on a journey of thousands of miles. With his personality, he would just do what he did. He wasn't even willing to explain himself. However, when he looked at Zhou's eyes, he knew that pregnant women were sensitive. He had no choice but to explain with a smile. Even if she was a very beautiful pregnant woman who had a grudge with him before, she was still a pregnant woman after all. The human rights of pregnant women were above everything else. This was a simple arithmetic problem, 2 to 1. Zhou was not a stupid woman. Although she had done some stupid things in the past few years, that was because she wanted to do it. When she heard Su Li's words and looked into Su Li's eyes, she suddenly smiled and said softly, "I really don't know if that hooligan surnamed Sure is lucky or if I am lucky." Although she said this lightly, Zhou Yu's eyes were filled with a faint sense of awe. She respected Su Li's actions, but she also feared Su Li's actions. There were very few people like him in the Federation. She wondered what kind of people he would become in the future. Su Li smiled and did not respond. He naturally got up and prepared to wash the dishes. Now, all the housework in this simple apartment was done by him. Therefore, when he was working with Professor Shin in the Research Institute, he did not have much time and energy to enter the database to search for the things he wanted. "Don't wash the dishes for now. Come with me for a walk. Don't just walk in the neighborhood today. I want to sit on the street." Su Li hesitated for a moment and nodded. Zhou Yu had been very quiet for the past few days. She did not cause any trouble for him. She did her duty as a pregnant woman and did not even contact her bad friends. It was reasonable for him to accompany her for a walk. Pregnant women needed to exercise and relax. The young couple walked along the big tree below the apartment and slowly walked towards the brighter lights of the business district. After a long silence, Su Li said with some shame, "I am not good with words. I guess you have been a bit bored these past few days. If Mr. Shi was here, I don't think you would find it so boring." When she heard Shi Qinghai's name, Zhou Yu's expression changed slightly. She immediately returned to her usual cold and indifferent appearance in front of others. From the corner of her eyes, she caught a glimpse of a few figures in the dark at the entrance of the neighborhood. She could not help but frown. Those people were tall and sturdy. It seemed that they had no intention of hiding their whereabouts, but they also had no intention of coming forward. Su Li looked over there and said, "Trouble is coming. This is a very natural thing. You can't take me to the triangle." Zhou Yu tightened the pony around her shoulders and said with a slight ridicule, "If you can really hide it from my family and let me give birth to the child, it will be a miracle." Su Li was surprised that the Zhou family found out about Zhou Yu's whereabouts so quickly. After all, it was not difficult for the Minister of Defense to investigate a person in the capital special district. "You said you were not afraid of trouble." Zhou Yu's hand slowly stroked her slightly bulging belly. Thinking about the tragedy of the child in her belly if she was caught by her family, her voice could not help but become cold. "The key is your attitude." Su Li looked at the guys who were obviously soldiers. He carefully held her arm and stepped over the metal railing at the entrance of the neighborhood. Chapter 164. Under the faint silver light of the two moons, this strange pair of man and woman, under the gaze of the big men in the shadows, steadily walked out of the gate of the neighborhood and slowly walked along the big green tree on the street. "If you are a good person, then in your eyes, I'm definitely not a good person." Zhou Yu's tone became harsh again, just like the unruly girl from before. Maybe it was because she was being watched by her family again, which made her a little unhappy. Fortunately, there was a hint of self-mockery in her harsh tone, so Su Li just frowned. "Do you want to go back?" Zhou Yu was not a girl who was used to thinking about other people, but maybe it was the chicken soup from the past 10 days that worked. She looked at Su Li, who was silent, and took the initiative to ask. Su Li glanced at the shadows behind the tree from the corner of his eyes. Those burly men who were obviously soldiers did not follow too closely, nor did they force their way forward. One of them took out his phone and seemed to be asking for instructions. He didn't know if the person on the phone was the deputy minister with the surname Zhou, or the gloomy and cold Major Zhou. "No need." Su Li thought for a moment and shook his head. "They don't dare to use force on you, so it's useless to use force on me." After all, we are on the edge of the capital, not a place like Lin Hai. These soldiers can't use guns. If things get out of hand, it won't look good on your father. That's true. Zhou Yu, who did not have his eyebrows drawn, had very thin eyebrows. Once they tightened due to emotions, they would be as cold as steel wire. He glanced behind him and sneered, "I'm afraid they're not sent by the old man." Sulu immediately understood what she meant, and his smile couldn't help but become a little bitter. To be honest, he was only a young man in his 20s, not a saint. Because of a woman that he was not familiar with, and even hated, he got into so much trouble. He couldn't help but think twice. However, the process of thinking and judgment was covered by his silent appearance. The result of his thinking was very simple. If the Zhou family found out that Zhou Yu was pregnant with another man's child, the consequences would be very tragic. Zhou Yu's child would definitely be lost. It is indeed a little troublesome. You can't just hide in the apartment. Every month, you have to go to the hospital for a checkup. You have to go out. The two of them slowly walked to the outside of a tea house. The stalkers behind them still didn't make any movements. Sulu and Zhou Yu sat by the window. They ordered a pot of chrysanthemum tea that pregnant women could drink and fell into silence. Other than how to take care of the baby in their arms, the two of them did not have much in common. After saying goodbye to Zhou Yu, Sulu walked out of the tea house. Leaning against the glass window, he took out a cigarette case, lit a cigarette, and took a deep puff. The taste between the tip of his tongue and the gap between his front teeth suddenly became a little sour. He subconsciously glanced at the 3 sevens on the cigarette case and couldn't help but smile. He thought of his beautiful friend who liked to wear her hair in a 3/7 style and only smoked 3/7 brand cigarettes. Sulu puffed out a faint smoke. He felt a little depressed. He didn't know where Shi Qinghai was hiding now. In the smoke, he seemed to be able to see the beautiful guy in a windbreaker blowing in the cold wind. He acted as an assassin and a traveler. His peach blossom eyes narrowed as he stared at everything in the Federation. He refused to forget his teacher and the anti-government army in the mountain. "You are going to be a father soon." Sulu whispered to Shi Qinghai, who he didn't know where he was. "In the end, I am your godfather." Immediately, he narrowed his eyes. He noticed that the big men in the shadows on the other side of the street had already hung up the phone and were preparing to walk over. On the other side of the glass, Ziyu looked out of the window indifferently. Through the glass, she saw Su Li's naturally hanging right hand holding the crumpled cigarette case. She saw the 3 sevens on it. A faint sadness appeared between her eyebrows. She and that man had the deepest crystallization of their relationship, but in fact, she didn't know that beautiful man, let alone like him. However, she really liked the little life in her belly that was constantly trying to grow up. Those soldiers in plain clothes crossed the street and came to the tea house. They stared at Sulu vigilantly, then spread out and occupied the 2 exits of the tea house and the corner of the street. Seeing the situation, Sulu knew that they were afraid that he and Zhou Yu would run away. He took a deep puff of the cigarette, lowered his body and stepped on the cigarette butt with the tip of his shoe. Ignoring those cold eyes, he threw the cigarette butt into the trash can and turned around to walk into the tea house. "It seems that someone is coming, but I don't know if it is your brother or your father," Sulu said. Zhou Yu quietly looked at him, who was sitting peacefully. The left corner of her thin lips gently raised, turning into a strange smile. She said, "It seems that you are really not afraid." A dark green Mustang off-road vehicle, with a harsh braking sound, stopped in front of the tea house. The few guests in the tea house looked over in surprise, wondering who on earth was so immoral to ruin the mood of drinking tea. When they saw that a few cold-looking officers walked out of the vehicle, they slowly withdrew their angry gazes. Since the war with Empire, the status and image of the Federal Army in the eyes of the public had increased a lot. Other than fear, the citizens of the Federation also had some respect for these soldiers who shed their blood on the front line. The door of the tea house was suddenly pushed open. A major in his 20s walked directly to the table by the window, accompanied by a few subordinate officers with a gloomy face. He stared at Zhou Yu with a gloomy expression. He lowered his voice, but couldn't suppress his anger and disgust. "Come home with me." The person who came was the staff major of the 3rd Military Region's Operations Department, Zhou Yu, the son of the Minister Zhou of the Ministry of National Defense. Ever since Tai Yuan's phone call, he had been obediently guarding the 3rd Military Region for the past 6 months and hadn't left until a few days ago, when he received the news that Zhou Yu had run away from home. He thought that he understood this sister of his. She was humiliated at the Double Moon Festival dance party, or she was in a bad mood, so she vented her anger on his family. Anyway, in the past few years, Zhou Yu had run away from home more than once, so he didn't pay much attention to it at first. He thought that she would come back in a few days, or at that time, he would be able to catch her from her bad friends. But he didn't expect that Zhou Yu would run away from home for real this time. She disappeared for more than 10 days, and none of Zhou Yu's original friends knew where she went. The situation seemed to be not good. Deputy Minister Zhou and his wife probably had a big fight at home, but Zhou Yu used the fastest time possible to come back from the 3rd Military Region. If the daughter of the Minister of Defense went missing, or if there was some kind of scandal or accident, it would be unacceptable. Although Deputy Minister Zhou Yingxing was also worried about his daughter, he couldn't ask the civil servants of the Federation government to help him find her, so the people that Zhou Yu asked for were mostly people from the 3rd Military Region. Today, he finally found out about his sister's whereabouts, so Zhou Yu didn't dare to delay and rushed to the tea house immediately. When he saw Zhou Yu's slightly haggard face without any makeup, on one hand, he was relieved, but on the other hand, he was filled with endless anger. As for the young man beside Zhou Yu, who had been silently drinking tea with his head down, he didn't pay attention to him at all. "Find out who you are." Zhou Yu lowered his voice and roared fiercely, "Go back." Zhou Yu repeated it a second time. Zhou Yu seemed to have just noticed her brother's arrival. Her face was slightly pale, and there was a hint of coldness in her half-smile. She looked up at him proudly and said coldly, "Why would I go back with you? Continue to be a bargaining chip for your promotion." As soon as these words came out of her mouth, Zhou Yu's eyes flashed with a strange color, which immediately turned into anger. Su Lu, who had been drinking tea with his head down, also slightly stiffened his fingers. He didn't think that Zhou Yu, who was now an unmarried mother, would give such an evaluation when she thought about her past with the Tai family. Zhou Yu slowly stood up from the tea house and looked at her brother calmly. Her slightly raised chin looked so proud, and there was a faint smile on her lips. Zhou Yu's eyes fell on the girl's slightly bulging stomach, and his body stiffened. The light red cotton dress was very soft on her stomach, as if it was afraid of affecting the little life inside. The anger in Zhou Yu's eyes instantly disappeared, and it turned into endless shock and some other emotions. The pale color quickly covered his cheeks. He couldn't believe his eyes. His finger trembled as he pointed at Zhou Yu's nose. He wanted to say something, but for a long time, he didn't say anything. "The family's face has been completely lost because of you." Major Zhou forced these extremely cold words out from between his teeth. Zhou Yu wasn't married, and she hadn't even been in a relationship before, but she was pregnant. No matter whose child this was, the Zhou family definitely couldn't accept it. He took a deep breath and forcefully suppressed the urge to slap his sister. He lowered his eyes and said coldly, "Take her back." The two officers who followed him into the tea house, as well as the few plainclothes soldiers who entered later, looked at each other. They could see the hesitation in each other's hearts, but in the end, they didn't dare to disobey the order and walked over. Su-lu sat outside of Zhou. If these soldiers wanted to take Zhou away, they would have to go through him. These soldiers didn't know his identity, so they turned around and looked at Zhou for instructions. Zhou's calmness at this time was completely forced out. His heart was already filled with endless rage. He stared at his sister, and when he noticed the gazes of his subordinates, his expression turned cold. Tie him up first. The intelligence clearly stated that Zhou had been living in this young man's apartment for the past few days. Although they didn't know the young man's name, he presumably had something to do with the child in Zhou's stomach. In Zhou's eyes, if there were no accidents, this young man was equivalent to a dead man. But before he died, he had to at least explain some things clearly. Chapter 165. A soldier's duty was to obey orders. Although the officer was shocked by the power coming from the palm of the young man in front of him, he still continued his actions. Behind him, another person followed him and pounced forward. The sound of the wind followed the movements and drifted through the air. It was like a tiger and a wolf hunting a rabbit in front of it. The expressions of the few customers in the tea house immediately changed, thinking that the kid was probably going to suffer a great loss. The present Su-lu, after that coma, had successfully digested the mysterious power in his body. He could control it at the most minute level. The 10 movements Uncle Feng Yu had taught him had long become instinctive to his body. Each small movement that had been broken down may not have had any rules, but in actual battle, it appeared particularly accurate and valiant. It was still the same saying. When it came to fighting, there were probably not many people in the entire Federation who were his match. No more accidents happened. He advanced, his shoulders bent, and with a few muffled pops, Su-li's feet were slightly apart. His right hand hung in the air, and his feet seemed to be rooted to the ground. The 2 officers from the Internal Affairs Department of the 3rd Military Region were sent flying with a muffled groan. One of them was hit hard in the chest, and his collarbone hurt. The other was viciously stepped on, and his knee was slightly deformed. That kind of pain, with a trace of soreness, invaded their well-trained and resilient bodies. It made their muscles begin to tremble, and they were unable to make any response or the next step. The officer who made the first move didn't even see clearly how Su-lu attacked. He only knew that in that instant, it was as if there were dozens of iron hammers smashing towards him from an unbelievable direction. It was so overwhelming and so irresistible. Although he blocked a few punches with his arms, he was still smashed until his body ached and his tongue tasted sweet. The officer wiped the blood at the corner of his lips and stared with a shocked gaze at Su-lu in front of him. He knew that the other party had held back earlier. If he had chosen a more vital area, he would probably be on the ground earlier. Su-lu was someone who liked to fight, and get jealous. Moreover, this involved Zhou and the child in her womb. There was no wind or jealousy, and this was not a problem that could be solved by fighting. His attacks were extremely measured. He pulled back his fists and protected Zhou. Looking at Zhou, he said, "This is Wangdu, not the 3rd Military Region, and not Linhai. You have to think about your father." It was only at this moment that Zhou saw Su-li's face clearly for the first time. He easily recognized who this ordinary face belonged to. Although he had only met Su-lu once, the humiliation the Zhou family siblings suffered that night, as well as Hook's crippling afterward, and that phone call from Tai Ziyuan made him remember Su-lu very deeply. At this moment, Zhou felt that the subordinates he had sent to find his sister were all trash. They only knew that the person living in the apartment was a young man, but they didn't know this young man's true identity. It's actually him. At this moment, Zhou's expression changed countless times. Who knew how many thoughts turned in his mind and how many strange guesses he came up with? But more than that, he was shocked and confused. He didn't understand why the guy that the young master of the Thai family favored would be together with his sister. A man and a woman alone for more than 10 days and nights, and his sister was pregnant. His gaze followed Su Li's open arms and moved slightly. Zhou Yu discovered that Su Li's palm, intentionally or not, was placed horizontally in front of Zhou Yu, especially in front of her slightly bulging belly. This cold-hearted major of the Federation had no choice but to twist his thoughts in the direction of those crappy and melodramatic romance dramas: brothers, women, heartbreak, madness, alcohol, consolation, mistakes, that secret knot in the pregnancy, that mysterious third party. Su Li's action of subconsciously protecting Zhou Yu's belly fell into Zhou Yu's eyes. It made him weave a rather complicated and rather vulgar story in his mind. And the more he thought about it, the more he felt that this was probably the truth. The problem was that this so-called truth was too shocking and unacceptable. It made him and the family he represented feel humiliated. So his face became darker and darker, so dark that it seemed like ink was about to drip out. He looked at Su Lo with eyes that grew colder and colder, so cold that it seemed like ice was about to form. His lips trembled slightly in anger, and the veins on his neck appeared and disappeared. If Xian Yi was suddenly pregnant, how angry would he be? He suddenly thought of his sister who had been away for a long time, and his mood became abnormally cold and uncomfortable. When he fought with those soldiers earlier, it was precisely because of these reasons that he didn't use too much force at the beginning. He took a few punches on his body, and in the end, he had no other choice but to use a fierce hand and beat those soldiers to the ground. He looked at Zhou Yu in front of him and said, "Enough. I waited for you today to solve the problem, not to fight." After all, the other party was Zhou Yu's family. Su Lo and Zhou Yu were not relatives. If he wanted to protect the child, he couldn't keep fighting with the other party. Zhou Yu was so angry that he laughed and said coldly, "Solve what problem?" "The child's problem." Su Lo narrowed his eyes slightly and said, "Zhou Yu needs you as her family, but I hope you can accept this child." "Who is the child's father?" Zhou Yu's gaze at this time could definitely be cold to death. He looked at Su Lo and said word by word, "If it wasn't you, what right do you have to stand here and talk about the problem? If it was you, you should be very clear about what you will face." When Zhou Yu asked who the child's father was, Su Lo was slightly stunned. He was about to say something when he heard the second half of Zhou Yu's sentence. He pursed his lips tightly and wiped the blood on his lips again without replying. It was indeed very naive and childish to hope that the Zhou family would accept this child of unknown origin. If the other party found out that the child's father was a fugitive from the Federation, this unborn child would not have much hope of surviving. "You're very good at fighting. You know the Crown Prince." Zhou Yu looked at him coldly. "If you can beat up 5 people today, I'll send a platoon tomorrow. If you can beat up a platoon, I'll send a company. You know that I won't dare to use guns in the capital, but if you really push me too hard, I can even get a cannon and blow up your little unit. You can't stay by her side forever. If I want to take her home, you'll never be able to stop me. Don't think that the Crown Prince can help you in any way. This is our Zhou family's matter, so he has to respect us." These were all real threats. Su Lo was silent for a moment and said, "Just pretend that the child in her stomach is mine. If you dare to touch this child, I'll make you and your father regret it very much." "Enough." Zhou Yu, who had been silent all this time, suddenly smashed the small porcelain teacup in her hand in anger. She looked at the only 2 men standing in the room with a cold and mocking expression and said, "You two are big men, but you only know how to talk. In the end, didn't you get one thing wrong? This child is mine. What does it have to do with you? It's also mine. Since when is it your turn to control it?" Su Lo thought to himself, "At least right now, you have to let the family think that this child is mine. Of course it has to do with me." Zhou Yu thought to himself, "You damned girl." The two men's inner monologue had just started, but it was stopped with a snort. Their faces became shocked and pale at the same time. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Zhou Yu expressionlessly picked up the broken porcelain shards and indifferently drew a line on her face that was as beautiful as a morning flower in the forest, pure and serene because of her pregnancy. Gradually, bright red blood seeped out from the line, and the flowers in the forest turned red. "Tell father that I want to stay with Su Le to take care of the baby. Don't bring these soldiers to harass me again." With a line of blood on her face, Miss Zhou coldly looked at her brother. "If you want to take me or kill him, you'll have to wait for 3 deaths. Then she turned her head and looked at Su Le, who was stiff all over. She narrowed her eyes and said with a smile, "Come with me to the hospital to get my face fixed. Also, check how the child is growing." Chapter 166. The tiny piece of porcelain slid across her porcelain-like face. In fact, it didn't make any sound, but when this scene fell into the eyes of Su Le and Zhou Yu, they seemed to have heard the most heart-trembling movement. The young girl's face was like jade, cold as ice, and a trace of blood suddenly appeared. There was no woman who didn't care about her appearance. Although the wound under her ear couldn't be considered disfigurement, the meaning behind it successfully shocked everyone present. Zhou Yu used such an extremely cold action to tell everyone present that she was now a madwoman and that she wasn't afraid of death. How could a person who wasn't even afraid of death be influenced by others? Su Le and Zhou Yu felt cold all over. They stared blankly at her face and listened to her faint smile as she spoke. Their hearts tightened a bit, and they felt the temperature in the tea house drop a bit. Zhou Yu's face was pale, and his 2 fists hanging by the side of his military uniform were tightly clenched. He couldn't speak of his heartache, anger, and fear. Only today did he realize that the sister in front of him, who was doted on by her family, could actually be so valiant. Brother and sister were connected by heart. Looking at the wound and blood on her face, he unconsciously took a step forward. However, in the end, he stopped under Zhou Yu's cold gaze. "Hurry and take her to the hospital." Zhou Yu roared at Su Le in a hurry and anger. Su Le helped Zhou Yu walk out of the tea house. Zhou Yu's hand, which was stained with blood, gently stroked her slightly bulging belly. She smiled and raised her chin slightly with indescribable pride and disdain. The soldiers who had been knocked to the ground in the tea house finally stood up with difficulty. They frowned and looked at the back of the young man who disappeared through the door. Countless thoughts turned in their minds. They knew that Su Le's actions were very measured, otherwise they would never be able to stand up again. Moreover, the soldiers of the Federation admired people with strong strength the most. To be able to knock down so many of them in such a short period of time, of course, he was not an ordinary person. They suddenly thought that if the young miss followed such a man, it wouldn't be too bad. On the ultra-thin LED screen in the living room of the apartment, the 24-hour news was being broadcasted. The most important event of the 67th year of the constitutional calendar was, of course, the presidential election. Although the election had not yet reached its climax, the 7 presidential candidates had already begun to seize every opportunity to appear in public. They explained their political program to the voters of the Federation, expressed their views on various aspects, and tirelessly tried to shape their image. Without a doubt, Senator Pobre and Governor Ross of Jingzhou, who were currently leading in the polls, had become the most likely candidates for the next president in the eyes of the media and the public. Their attention and focus were placed on these 2 competitors. Now that the Federation had reached a great internal reconciliation and united against the threat of the Empire, these 2 people, who each had the Green Dragon Mountain Reconciliation Agreement and the support of the majority of the people in the 4 provinces, had already left their competitors in the dust. Su Le sat in an armchair and watched the news with narrowed eyes. His attention was not on Pobre, who had a dark complexion, although he admired this politician from his hometown. He only stared closely at the old man beside Governor Ross, who had a calm expression and looked very trustworthy. Senator Medellin. It was Senator Medellin's sudden participation in the war that allowed Governor Ross to gain the support of the majority of the people in the 4 provinces. This Federation senator, who was born in the anti-government army, had an unshakable position in the hearts of the people in the 4 provinces. In the Linhai Gymnasium incident, a total of 37 innocent people died. A total of 119 Thai family security personnel and military assassins were killed. After the investigation, another 14 people either committed suicide or were killed. Shi Qinghai's most respected teacher committed suicide by jumping off a building. He also became a fugitive of the Federation, who could not see the light of day. Zhang Xiaomeng became a piece of smoke in the flames in the sky of S2. Su Lut silently watched the well-respected old man on the news. He kept repeating the numbers in his heart, and the pain that he would never forget. All kinds of people died. Zhang Xiaomeng was dead. Shi Qinghai was missing. His woman and his child were right behind him. And the culprit behind all of this was this senator on the screen. However, in the political environment of the Federation, even if there was no indirect evidence, neither the Federation government or the Thai family could expose Senator Medellin's hidden cruelty. If they wanted to try and carry out this task, they could only become this person's political propaganda and capital to incite the people. Moreover, within the Federation, who knew how many forces were secretly supporting this old man who could bring them the position of president? Su Li's eyebrows gradually furrowed. He gradually calmed down and turned off the television. He turned his head and looked at Zhou Yu, who was lying on the sofa and was about to fall asleep. At this time, the right side of Zhou Yu's face was wrapped in snow-white gauze. Her eyes were tightly shut, and she looked exceptionally weak. But Su Lu finally understood why this pregnant girl, who was not yet 20 years old, always liked to wear red. It turned out that under her cold and arrogant appearance, there was a burning red heart. The word weak would never belong to her. The porcelain shard that fell on her delicate skin was not deep. After a simple treatment at the hospital, they returned home without any stitches. The emergency doctor only applied a layer of biological glue to confirm that there was no major problem. Even if there was a scar, it would not be too deep. After a few skin treatments, Zhou Yu's face would no longer have a scar. Although it was not deep, the scene was still hair-raising. When Su Lut saw the wound, he understood that as long as this girl in red made up her mind, she would not care about anyone's objections. She used the blood on her face to warn her family that she did not care about things like life. So Su Li's mood was a little depressed. If he had known earlier, perhaps he would not have been so deeply involved in this matter. He furrowed his brows as he thought about it. The young lady in front of him was so cruel to others and to herself. Perhaps she only wanted to use the child in her womb to express her resistance to her many years of environment and betrayal to her family. She did not care who the child was. As if she felt the two calm and profound gazes, Zhou Yu's eyelashes fluttered and she woke up. She leaned against the soft sofa and looked at Su Lu with a complicated expression. She opened her mouth and said, "You don't seem to be in a good mood. Right now, your body does not only belong to you. What's mine is mine. I'm not your friend's rogue official's birth machine." Zhou Yu's gaze was a little angry. She was now very sensitive to hearing such words. Su Li's always silent and calm attitude made her feel like she was a hen, and Su Lu, who had lived with her for the past few days, was like a farmer raising chickens. All he cared about was the eggs he laid. Hearing Zhou Yu's sharp and angry criticism, for some reason, Su Li's heart also began to accumulate a ball of violent emotions. After a moment of silence, he slowly said, "At least, this body is not a means for you to express your attitude of betrayal. Everyone had their own sensitive spots. Zhou Yu's was sensitive to the relationship between eggs and hens. Su Li's was sensitive to words like betraying his family and searching for himself. He did not like these words. In fact, he was pained by these words. In his short 20 years of life, the girl he had the deepest relationship with had sacrificed herself for her ideals and died because of betrayal. Zhou Yu heard the faint bitterness and pain in Su Li's words. She saw longing and sadness in Su Li's eyes. She knew this young man was thinking of Zhang Xiaoming, so she closed her mouth and did not say anything more. I am a person who is not muddle-headed when it comes to important matters. Su Lu suddenly defined himself. But on many small matters, my choices seem very foolish and very naive. Including your matter. What does it have to do with me? Why do I do this? I just want the right to exist and the wrong to disappear. Perhaps it won't change anything, but at least I want to change the people around me. He stood up, looking a little lonely, and walked towards the bathroom. Those who committed murder and arson still talked with confidence and assurance. Those who were born rich did not care about their own lives. The people in the mining area lived in silence, but they forced themselves to be optimistic. There had always been a lot of unfairness in this world. Su Lu knew this, and he thought he had long been used to it. However, like a tree that kept swaying in the wind, his heart could not calm down. Day after day, he worked in the research institute and accompanied a pregnant woman who had nothing to do with him. He felt very powerless, as if there was nothing he could do. The situation changed the next day. When the black car without a logo drove into the first military academy, it went through several layers of chip scanning and authorization verification before it once again entered the familiar and empty laboratory. Su Lit stood in front of the table in a daze, looking at the row of characters reflecting the light. Professor Shen was sick and was admitted to the Air Force General Hospital. Today, Su Lu was the only one left in the laboratory. He stood in front of the table blankly for more than 10 seconds. He did not see the urgent commands on the table. He no longer needed to quickly extract data, calculate the data, and send it to Professor Shin like how he operated the mecha. There was no bustle, no sweat, and no soreness. There was only the slight sound of the ventilation system above the quiet laboratory. Su Lu was not used to it for a while. However, after being stunned for more than 10 seconds, a smile appeared on his ordinary and amiable face. Today, this laboratory belonged to him. His slender and steady fingers moved across the large holographic screen on the table and sent several commands to the central control computer in the laboratory. The ventilation system of the laboratory was adjusted to level 3. The utility hatch, which had been closed for a long time, opened. The self-cleaning machine began to drive out and began to clean. A few days ago, he had already prepared the materials for repair. Professor Shen's laboratory had a large database capacity and stored all kinds of automatic tools and materials. Although he did not know why these things were needed for purely theoretical research, Su Lu knew that he needed them very much. He had not held a metal tool for a long time. The heavy feeling made Su Lu feel close to it. It only took him more than 10 minutes to repair the large dust removal equipment at the back of the laboratory. Along with the continuous buzzing sound of electric current, the fine dust in the space that absorbed natural sunlight and light began to reduce at a speed visible to the naked eye. While waiting for the dust to be removed, Su Lu returned to the holographic screen table. He narrowed his eyes and began to quickly browse through the laboratory database. With the foundation of these 10 days of work, his familiarity with the database had reached an astonishing level. There were a total of 21 index trees, and he only opened 6 of them before he found what he was looking for. The transmission of bioelectric current in the B-type material data line. The interaction system between the microchip and the human neuron. Su Lu looked at the titles of the 2 folders and his eyes suddenly lit up. What he was most concerned about was the mysterious power in his body and the identity chip behind his neck. In front of him were two pieces of information that had been forgotten by the scientists of the Federation. For him, they were like two giant pieces of cake. After quickly skimming through the titles of the two folders, Sulu closed his eyes and sorted out the information in his mind. Finally, he opened his eyes and sighed softly. Regarding the technology of microchips, the Research Institute of the Nutshell Mobility Company certainly had some achievements. Especially the database of the Research Institute, which was shared with a few major military academies and the Academy of Science. Suluk found a lot of things, but these microchip technologies were mainly focused on the application microchip. Whether it was the structure of battle armor, mecha, or base network, they were all cold metal structures. What Sulu really cared about was the identity chip. The kind of chip that could emit weak pulses on its own. There was no trace of it in the database. Sulu was not disappointed because he knew very well that this chip technology was not very useful for the entire Federation except for positioning and identification of information fragments. However, it was this chip that was related to the mysterious Bureau of Proclamation and the omnipresent First Charter. With his access level, it was impossible for him to access the information that was strictly blocked by the Bureau of Proclamation. Even the internal database of the military did not have this information. Suluk turned his attention to another aspect. At this time, the dusting in the laboratory had finished, but the level of dust in the transparent operation room on the left was still decreasing. Suluk seized this time, and with the help of the computer, he took out the Type B transmission material he needed and waited silently outside the operation room. With a beep, the dust removal was finished. After putting on the gray operation suit, Sulu narrowed his eyes through the electronic mirror and automatic mechanical equipment. He carefully and calmly turned on the microcurrent simulation generator and silently watched the data feedback on the light screen. Pass rate, wear rate. Chapter 167. According to Feng Yu's theory, the human body was the first machine. Whether it was a mecha or a battleship, they were all just extensions of the human body. Those cold metal components, complicated circuitry chips, and terrifying firepower had to listen to the orders of the human body and obey the orders of the human body. Just like driving a car, no matter how fast the car was, the driver's hands still determined the direction of the car. If one explored this direction, they would find a very important link. How did the human brain's activities and commands be transmitted to various machines? The human alliance had been developing for many years. From the earliest days of manual control, to the input of data command programs, to the research of human simulators that had been abandoned halfway through. This was a very important aspect, but there had never been a revolutionary change. On the battlefield between the Federation and the Empire, in the mecha that climbed the mountains, and in the giant battleships in the darkness of space, humans were still using these methods to convert their will into powerful energy through cold metal. Take the M-series mecha, which represented the Federation's engineering standards, as an example. They had always used a touch screen to operate the mecha. The mecha's operation mainly tested the pilot's judgment ability and the input speed of the program. After the M-series mecha entered the 5th generation, an additional auxiliary control lever was added to the lower left hand of the control cabin. The scientists of the Federation had once tried to use sensitive data-gathering microprocessors to cover the entire body of a pilot, directly capturing the minute movements of every inch of the pilot's skin. Then, the signals would be transmitted to the central control computer of the mecha for processing, finally transforming into the corresponding movements of the mecha. This was a simulation artifact that had become an antique. The plan for the simulator was aborted because after a long period of experimentation, the experts found a few problems that could never be solved. The first was the difficulty of data collection. The structure of the human body seemed simple, but in fact, it was more complicated than the most complicated machine. The corresponding changes in every human movement contained too much data. The degree of contraction of the double muscle fibers, the direction of the movement, blood pressure, and even the changes in the surface tension of the skin. These subtle changes had to be completely identified by the data acquisition microprocessor and successfully converted into the corresponding movement. Even with the help of the powerful computing power of the central control computer, the accuracy rate was always around 70%. On the fierce battlefield, the most important thing for mecha was accuracy and speed. If they could only guarantee this level of accuracy, then they were basically useless. The second problem of using the simulator occurred after the experimental simulator had been put into use. At that time, the pilots in charge of the experiment were all ace pilots of the military. Their movements were extremely precise, without the slightest bit of redundancy. They could control the trembling of their every muscle valiantly, thus increasing the accuracy rate of the mecha controlled by the simulator to more than 95%. But when they actually entered the actual combat practice, in less than 10 minutes, all the ace pilots had fainted from exhaustion. After that, they found that using the simulator to control the mecha required, on one hand, to ensure the accuracy and precision of the movements, on the other hand, to continuously perform the movements, which was really too taxing on the human body. Before the simulator project was aborted, in fact, the military had secretly tried a more advanced control method, which was to capture the pilot's brainwaves and then analyze them through a computer to directly control the mecha. Unfortunately, this seemingly feasible plan failed miserably in the end. This was because the scholars discovered that they had once again underestimated the complexity of the human body, especially the complexity of the brain. The brainwave signals released by the human brain were too chaotic, and the effective information fragments could only account for 1% of the signal at most. If they wanted to successfully capture the effective information in the brainwaves, they would need a more powerful brainwave filter. However, after paying the price of more than 10 pilots' deaths or idiocy, there was no possibility of continuing this plan. Sulik silently stared at the continuous feedback of the data on the monitor screen. From time to time, he would jot down some key values on a piece of white paper beside him. A few hours had passed silently, and he had also been observing the state of transmission of the simulated bioelectric current in the B-section material for a few hours. While waiting for the data to come back, he would think of some things. In the Husk Institute's internal forum, he had once seen a post in the gossip section. The post said in a mysterious tone that the reason why the use of brainwaves to directly control mecha had failed was because the Bureau of Proclamation was unwilling to release the chip technology. At the end of the post, the author, who was obviously a high-ranking researcher of the Federation, lamented that within a few thousand years, there would be no other way for humans to use machines. They could only use the extremely unaesthetic manual operation. While reading the post, Su Lo remained silent. This was because he had once seen a very strange method of control, one that did not belong to any currently known method. That was 1.5 years ago in the suburbs of Heshi region. He had been hiding in a large tree and had seen with his own eyes Uncle Fengyu, standing outside the mecha, but with those 10 trembling fingers, he had successfully seized control of the M52 mecha from the central control computer of the mecha. That scene had always been in his mind, never fading away. Afterwards, when he carefully recalled that scene, Su Li's attention remained on those trembling fingers. This was because within his own body, there was also this kind of trembling, surging, gushing power. Su Li needed to consider the existence of such a massive existence as a battleship. However, he had always been thinking, could it be that one day, he could also be like Uncle Fengyu, transferring that surge of power within his body into the cold metallic electrical elements? Like a stream of data, successfully controlling those unconscious component weapons. This was an extremely daring, even preposterous idea. The human body was made of flesh and blood, how could it possibly produce a stream of data that machines could identify? However, Su Lo was increasingly convinced of this possibility, especially after he had fainted. The mysterious power within his body had already merged with his body, and his life had once again taken a fork in the road. Uncle Feng Yu had once done it, and Su Lu was currently researching and exploring it. If he could also succeed, this would definitely be a fundamental change in the way humans controlled machines. The temperature in the laboratory was extremely suitable, and the temperature and humidity in the dustless operation room were maintained at an extremely strict level. Su Lu had been fully focused on his experiments for several hours, but there was still not a single drop of sweat on his forehead. The results of the experiments were not out of Su Li's expectations. The transmission of the simulated biological current within the wires was not too different from normal current. However, because the current itself was too weak, the loss rate appeared to be too high. Meanwhile, the B-type material wire was already the material with the lowest loss rate that could be found in the database. The problem before him was that the situation Su Lu had envisioned, using the microcurrent of the human body to control a mecha, or rather to control the chipset of a mecha, did not seem to have the slightest chance of success from these experiments. The weak current generated by the simulated current generator was already extremely similar to the spontaneous biological current of the human body. There should not be a problem with these materials, but the data collector at the end of the wire was unusually cold and firm in its summary. The electron stream did not produce any strange changes. In other words, it could not carry any data. Su Lu had never hoped that he would be able to solve his biggest question in just one day's time and allow the mysterious power within his body to obtain the greatest benefits. He had even mentally prepared himself that perhaps he would never be able to come into contact with that magical world in this lifetime. Using the human body to directly control a mecha seemed to be a very simple proposition, but it was an extremely crazy idea. Su Lu would not be discouraged by this temporary setback at all. In fact, he did not even see these experiment results as a setback at all. Su Lu took off his goggles. His eyes that were exposed outside the mask were slightly tired. He opened the transparent door of the operation room, walked in front of the holographic screen table, and began to quickly browse through the data in the database again. Then, he fell into deep thought as he looked at a piece of historical data. Those previous experiments were just an attempt to confirm the doubts in his heart. Although he had failed, it made him even more determined to temporarily give up that crazy idea and switch to the idea of researching the antique simulation system, especially after seeing the research report on the flaws of the simulation system. He could not use the trembling in his body, for now, he would temporarily treat it as bioelectricity, to control a mecha. However, with his powerful mysterious power, he seemed to be able to use the simulation system that the Federation's scientists and military experts had already sentenced to death to directly control a mecha. In those mecha tests in Area H1, when he had fought against Zhou Yu's silver mecha, although Su Lu had only used the antique simulation system in that final instant and had only been able to make a move for less than half a second, he had still succeeded. Unlike those ace mecha pilots who had conducted the experiments back then, when Su Lu used the simulation system, the commands transmitted were transmitted through the trembling power within his body. The fine control of that power was far beyond the precision of human control over their own muscles. Furthermore, Su Lu would not be like those predecessors who had collapsed from exhaustion due to exhaustion. This was because he used his mind to mobilize that mysterious power, not his nerves. Other than the fact that his stomach would become extremely hungry after using this power, there were no other problems. The fewer links there were to transmit commands between the human body and the mecha, the less exhaustion there would be, and the faster the mecha would be able to carry out the human's intentions. Su Lu, who could use the simulation system, undoubtedly had the potential to surpass the current level of machine control in the Federation and the Empire. Chapter 168. Su Lu rubbed his eyes lightly and put in some eye drops. Ever since he was young, his goal was to become a top mech mechanic in the Federation, so he was especially protective of his eyes and hands. This had already become an instinct of his. When he stepped out of the laboratory door, the sun was already high up in the sky. It shone through the transparent heat shield of the dome of the research institute and fell on the people inside. Only then did he remember that it was time for lunch. In the long metallic corridor, people wearing all kinds of work clothes walked silently. There was very little communication between the staff of the research institute, and very little chatting. They seemed to be used to dividing themselves into groups according to their research groups and staying in their own laboratories to conduct research, like a nest of guinea pigs that were unwilling to come out of their holes. Even the coordination and technical support between the various departments was often done through email. This was exactly how Sulu imagined a research institute to be, but he also knew that there was no such thing as a pure land in human society. A research institute with a strong academic atmosphere was still a microcosm of this society. There were still political struggles and conflicts in this place, but these ugly things basically only happened in the upper echelons of the research institute and did not affect basic researchers like him. Sulu ate silently in the cafeteria, chewing carefully. He knew that he had to eat a little more now. Otherwise, once he activated that mysterious power in his body in the afternoon, he did not know how hungry he would be. The Research Institute and the First Military Academy shared an area, but the various facilities were strictly separated. In the cafeteria, which was a full 1,000 square meters, there were not many researchers eating. Sulu sat in the corner alone in silence. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed that his colleagues who usually did not like to talk were much more lively at the table, especially those who belonged to the same research group. They were excitedly talking about something, as if there was an insurmountable problem in some important research project in the engineering department. The Shell Motor Company had a strong government and military background. The most independent and crucial department was naturally the R&D department. If the research center was said to be more focused on theoretical guidance and exploration of the frontiers of science, then the R&D department was more focused on practical R&D. The research results of the research center often required the technicians of the R&D department to transform them into actual objects. The battleships, mechas, even cars, yachts, and home appliances produced by the various subsidiaries of the Shell Motor Company were all designed by the R&D department. The people from the Research Institute naturally did not think much of the technicians from the engineering department. In their eyes, these fellows who only knew how to bury themselves in all kinds of tools were really too boring. They had completely forgotten the true purpose of scientific research, and at most, they could only be considered as employees of the Research Institute. But in the eyes of the engineering department, while those old professors in the Research Institute were worthy of respect, these assistant researchers wearing white coats had no right to be proud of them. They were all a bunch of boring fellows who only knew how to memorize theoretical formulas, and only knew how to boast, but did not even know the width of a mecha's track. They were even worse than the doctors who also wore white coats. Because of the difference in nature, the two R&D departments developed some sort of opposing sentiment. Whether it was the government of the Federation or the military, whether it was the company's board of directors or the technical director who was truly leading the way for the Shell Motor Company, none of them had any intention of trying to eliminate this opposing sentiment. In their eyes, this opposing sentiment was an extremely beneficial form of competition. It could promote the R&D standards of the Shell Motor Company and even the entire Federation to improve faster. The R&D department had a problem, so of course the people in the Research Institute were happy. Sulu smiled and did not continue to listen to this gossip. He lowered his head and continued eating. In the cafeteria, other than Sulu, the other researchers were all gathered together according to their research topics. This made his silhouette seem somewhat lonely and desolate. Sulu himself also noticed this point. He sighed softly in his heart. Whether it was at Donglin or at Yue University, his personality seemed to be unable to blend in with the crowd. It was rare for him to have a few true friends, but they were all shut down, left, and died, could it be that he was destined to be alone forever? No one was willing to be Professor Shin's assistant. Although this old professor had a highly respected position in the academic world and was one of the rarest living Nebula Award winners in the Federation, the subject of quantum measurable dynamics was definitely not a promising one. It was enough to dampen the enthusiasm of all the researchers. In the quiet laboratory, other than Professor Shin, who usually stayed on the second floor in a daze from time to time, there was only Su Lo and the static sound of the holographic screen on the table. This was also the source of Su Li's loneliness in the research institute. Today, Professor Shin was sick, so this laboratory was equivalent to Su Li's alone. He sat on the metal stairs leading to the office upstairs. He squinted his eyes and sized up the spacious laboratory. He subconsciously took out a cigarette from his pocket and lit it. At the same time, he turned on the dust removal system beside him. It was not unprecedented for a speck of dust to destroy a chip and then a battleship. Although this was a laboratory and not a manufacturing factory with extremely strict requirements, Su Lu did not want all of his future experiments to come up with ridiculous results. The light green smoke filled his eyes and then quickly turned into a whirlpool in the air. It was absorbed by an invisible force, and the laboratory was clear again. Su Lu held the cigarette between his lips. He squinted his eyes and enjoyed a rare moment of leisure. His eyes slowly and attentively scanned everything in the laboratory. With Professor Shin's qualifications, it was not surprising that he could have such a large and complex database. What Su Lu was curious about was why his little assistant had access to such a high level of access. It was because of this access that he could find a lot of things he needed. What surprised him even more was that in this two-story laboratory, there were actually so many materials that were rarely seen. Some of these materials were polymer materials that he had only seen in academic journals when he was in Donglin District. In the large warehouse behind the building, there were all kinds of precision instruments and tools that Su Lu was most familiar with and loved. Su Lu frowned and stubbed out the cigarette. He could not understand why an old professor who was engaged in pure theoretical physics research would need these things. Since he could not understand, he stopped thinking about it. Anyway, Su Lu knew that everything in this laboratory could help him accomplish a lot of things he wanted to do. It was like a big piece of pie falling from the sky and accurately hitting his head. The most oily edge of the chopped green onions was delivered right into his mouth. Was there anything more wonderful in the world than this? No. In the past, in this laboratory, Su Lu was busy with the various tasks that Professor Shin gave him. He did not have the time or courage to do his own things. However, at this moment, the laboratory belonged to him alone. Of course, he had to seize this opportunity. After stuffing out the cigarette and confirming the time, Su Lu took a few deep breaths and calmed down. He put his right hand on his left wrist and gently rubbed the metal bracelet that Uncle Shin gave him a few times. With a calm expression, he silently walked to the holographic screen table and began to examine the information he needed. From this information, he obtained the information he needed and found the appropriate materials in the warehouse to form the tools he needed. Mechanic Yu Feng, or Uncle Feng Yu, was the #1 wanted criminal in the Federation. In his eyes, Su Lu was a mechanical genius, so Su Lu was without a doubt a genius. Especially since there was no one watching over the laboratory today, he no longer had to worry about anything. The strange ideas in his mind, the rich practical experience he had over the years, and the systematic review of theoretical knowledge under the pressure of old Professor Shin these days, all blended together and began to emit light. Accompanied by the buzzing sound of the microcontrolled machine tool and the electronic etching needle in the warehouse behind the laboratory, it did not take long for Su Lu to successfully assemble 4 simple-looking instruments. Although the appearance was ugly, if these 4 monitoring instruments were to appear in front of the experts of the Nutshell Engineering Department, they would definitely be amazed and shocked. They would use the most effective method to recruit the instrument maker. Because the circuits of these instruments were simple, the working principles were stable, and the ideas were unique. They had completely exceeded the conventional thinking of the average engineer. To put it simply, only a genius or an idiot's design, coupled with the creation of a top-notch engineering expert, could achieve such an effect. Perhaps this was not the most advanced, but in terms of concept, it was definitely the most original. And what the Federation engineers, who had been stuck in a dilemma for many years, needed the most now was a completely different way of thinking. Right at this moment, the door of the laboratory opened. Sulu walked to the door and signed for the instrument he had applied for. The main purpose of this instrument was similar to a signal collection system for mecha control simulators. The application he had just sent out via email before lunch had actually arrived so quickly. Only now did he truly understand that as long as he had the authority given to him by Professor Shin, at least a large portion of the Shell Motor Company's resources would be open to him. This was really an endless mountain of treasures that he did not immediately begin to test the strange power in his body. Instead, he first turned off the automatic recording program in the central control computer in the laboratory. Then, he narrowed his eyes and examined every corner of this spacious laboratory. In the end, he still felt uneasy. After a moment of hesitation, he fished out a palm-sized instrument from the pocket of his coat on the chair and lightly pressed a button. With the movement of Su Li's fingers, a faint blue light was emitted from the small tool. It was like the stars in the distant universe, without a trace of shaking. It calmly and solemnly enveloped his body, and gradually expanded until it enveloped the entire interior space of the laboratory. In the bracelet that Uncle Feng Yu had left him, there were no impressive blueprints, but there was an assembly diagram of the chip circuit of this small instrument. Until today, Sulu still did not know what principle this small instrument, which could temporarily isolate the glory of the Charter and cause the multi-layered electronic surveillance network of the Federation to fail, worked according to. However, this did not stop him from replicating such a tool a long time ago. As early as when he had been undergoing mecha training in Yue University's H1 area, Sulu had already made preparations for this. The isolation provided by the faint blue glow did not last long. Sulu did not immerse himself in his memories. Instead, he entered the operation room as quickly as possible and connected the 4 assembled instruments to the surface of his skin through a data cable. Finally, he connected the cable to the signal collector for the simulator he had just applied for. In the spacious and quiet laboratory, only the sound of electronic particles from the ventilation system and the dust removal system could be heard. In the transparent operation room, Su Lu, who was enveloped in a blue glow, closed his eyes. Then, his body began to tremble slightly. This trembling grew more and more intense, to the point that the data cable connected to his body was like a willow branch in the wind, swaying incessantly, ready to break at any moment. Chapter 169. Sparks flew everywhere, and the alarm lights flashed continuously in the control room. Thankfully, the smoke detector was not activated. Sulu stared silently at the signal collector beside him, which had been destroyed by the electric current, and could not help but shake his head in frustration. He pulled out those data wires that were stuck to his bare skin, and the low-voltage resistance chips left some round marks on the surface of his skin. Right then, Sulu had a rare moment of self-deprecation. He really did look like a spotted dog. He went to the operation room and put on a coat. He threw the pieces of wires and instruments that had been shattered into pieces by his own power into the waste disposal chamber. Then, he lowered his head and moved closer to the light screen. He began to carefully observe the data records of the 4 monitoring devices that he had previously assembled. Just as he had predicted before the experiment, the signal collector could not completely identify the mysterious power in his body. The data on the monitoring devices showed that there was only about a 20% success rate. And when Sulu had finally increased the output of the power in his body, that signal collector had already been overloaded, and had been destroyed in a shower of electrical sparks. In Yue University's H1 section, during that mecha battle with Zhou Yu, Sulu had used the mysterious power in his body in the end to operate his mecha directly through the simulation system. That was how he had managed to make that Black M prototype mecha display such incredible power in that instant. The experiment before his eyes proved that Sulu could still only use that power to strengthen the movement of his own body, and could not directly use this power to operate the simulation system. How had he done it that day? Sulu narrowed his eyes, and began to recall his practice in the library's H1 section, as well as that final battle where he had to walk away with his hands on his stomach. Gradually, the serious expression in his eyes relaxed, and he gave up on thinking. A success rate of at least 20% was already high enough. After all, this was his first experiment, and he had not used the real simulation system, just a backup signal collector. Sulu knew that if he really wanted to use this never-before-seen method to operate mecha or other mechanical equipment in the future to obtain his own skills in the Human Federation Society, he would need to improve on two aspects simultaneously. On one hand, he would need to increase his proficiency in using the mysterious power in his body, and more importantly, he would need to understand how the simulation system could identify the power's workings through the trembling of his skin, and then improve on the simulation system. To truly achieve the unity of man and machine, that was an extremely difficult and distant matter. A temporary setback was nothing. Sulu tilted his head slightly, looking at the data he had recorded. He thought to himself that right now, he needed a real simulation system to carry out the modifications, or, if he could have a real military mecha, that would be even better. Mecha control simulation systems had long been abandoned by the experts of the Federation. It had already been several decades since there had been a research project on this topic. However, those simulation systems left in the warehouse were still in good condition, and were sometimes even sold to mecha enthusiasts as part of their collections. Sulu had once ordered a set of simulation equipment from the Shell Motor Company as a collector, and had personally used it. It could be said that he was one of the very few people in the Federation Society who was familiar with simulation systems. The problem was that research in this area had long been abandoned. If the Federation Research Department wanted to modify the original system now, they would already be missing a large portion of the engineering support. Furthermore, Sulu was just one person. Even if he had an admirable talent in the field of machinery, this sort of modification idea still seemed a little far-fetched at the moment, like the ravings of a lunatic. However, he was confident, because other than the incredibly large database in this laboratory, as well as those Federation's most advanced equipment, there were also countless strange, but clearly very advanced blueprints in his mind. The way he saw it, these blueprints had been left to him by Uncle Feng Yu through the chip on the back of his neck. The powerful mysterious power within his body had also been left to him by Uncle Feng Yu. From very simple logic, he could deduce that there must be some knowledge on how to use this power to control mecha. Sulu finished reading the data in silence, and then destroyed it all. This matter involved one of the three great secrets within his body. He did not want the Federation government to link him to Uncle Feng Yu. Right at this moment, a gentle beep suddenly sounded from the holographic screen outside the operations room. Sulu was slightly taken aback. He buttoned up the buttons on his military uniform and walked out of the operations room. At this time, those small tools that could block out all electronic surveillance were no longer glowing with blue light, and he had put them away into his pocket. On the holographic screen was an email sent out by the head of the 3rd Division of the Research Institute. The markings on the email clearly showed that this email had been sent to every independent laboratory in the 3rd Division of the Research Institute, and its confidentiality level was S level. Sulu read the contents of the email, and his eyes gradually narrowed. Just like the news he had heard in the cafeteria at noon, this email said that the new mecha recently developed by the Shell Motor Company Engineering Department had encountered some kind of problem, and required technical support from the Research Institute. The higher-ups of the research institute did not impose any rigid requirements on the various laboratories. They only listed a few problems that the engineering department had encountered in the email, and hoped that the researchers in the various laboratories would be able to provide some feasible ideas. Su-lo quickly finished reading this email and sank into deep thought. After entering the Husk Institute, he had signed a confidentiality agreement, so he was not worried that he would know too much that he should not know. On the contrary, he knew the background of this matter. The Shell Motor Company engineering department was currently developing a new mecha, temporarily named MX. Last autumn, this mecha had been successfully developed, but after that, during Whitewater Security Company's experimental use of the mecha, they seemed to have encountered some extremely difficult problems. The Shell Motor Company was a huge company. Other than its deep background in the government and the military, its industry was involved in every corner of the industry related to machinery. Just like the company's slogan, where there was metal, there would be shells. However, the most cutting-edge engineering research and development was still in the area of battleships and mechas. These highly refined engineering results could often be used for civilian use. However, these various types of machinery that came out of the laboratories and engineering departments, no matter how many times they had been tested under harsh laboratory conditions, had to be put into practical use in the end. Before they were fully formed, there had to be certain departments that specialized in conducting experiments on these new weapons and tools. The huge Shell Motor Company's various new weapons needed to be tested in actual combat. It was precisely for this purpose that the board of directors of the Shell Motor Company established the Whitewater Security Company, which was directly responsible to the board of directors and the Ministry of National Defense. The Shell Motor Company did not have the intention of generating profits for the Whitewater Company. For countless years, the latest results of the Shell Motor Company had been put into Whitewater Company's experiments, and in actual combat, they had discovered many problems that were difficult to discover in the laboratory. Although this security company did not have a high position within the Shell Motor Company, they had the most advanced weapons of the Federation, the technical support of the entire Shell Engineering Department, and the support of the Ministry of National Defense. Of course, the combat power they displayed was also very strong. In today's Federation, the Whitewater Security Company was on par with Black Hawk and Blue Bird. They received non-stop business, and their profits were gradually increasing. This made the Shell Motor Company's board of directors and shareholders who only knew how to collect dividends very happy. Su Li's gaze had long since moved away from the email. The latest model of the MX mecha developed by the engineering department had been exposed during an armed operation by the Whitewater Company at the edge of the Triangle Zone. This had directly led to the failure of this mission, which had angered the Ministry of National Defense and the Shell Motor Company's board of directors. The engineering department was under great pressure, so during the spring recruitment exam, the engineering department's human resources manager, Jose, had personally come to the scene to snatch people away. This was mainly to deal with the mecha's research and repair work. Su-lo did not know much about the Whitewater Company, but he knew the predicament the engineering department was in now. He stared at the several block schematics downloaded onto the holographic desktop and narrowed his eyes slightly. After the experiment just now, he had been thinking that he needed a simulation system and a mecha. He did not expect the opportunity to come knocking on his door. From the email, it could be seen that as long as the laboratory staff of the research institute could come up with a solution, the engineering department would definitely invite that person over, and that person would definitely be able to have the most intimate contact with the mecha. This was an opportunity, and Su-lo knew that he had to seize it. However, regarding the effects of the turbulent flow of electrons in the engine under conditions of 3 times gravity. Just looking at the long list of names, he knew that it was extremely tricky. How should he seize this opportunity? Give me strength, Chip. Su-lo opened the schematics, and at the same time, began to quickly search through the strange schematics in his mind. The images of reality and illusion overlapped before his eyes, and then separated. Countless amounts of data and information began to flow rapidly in his mind. After a long time, the pale-faced Sulu closed his eyes. He finally found some vague information from the schematics in his mind. It seemed to be related to the problems the Nutshell Engineering Department had encountered when they were researching and developing the mecha. The schematics in his mind were not omnipotent. At least, they could not directly solve those problems. However, the meticulous design of those schematics and the genius of the idea had opened countless doors for Sulu. Comparing knowledge was the easiest way to find problems with each other. Sulu opened his eyes. They were calm, and he began to lower his head to re-examine the engine schematics sent over by the engineering department. There was still a long time before the deadline requested by the Nutshell Engineering Department. Sulu was in a hurry. Moreover, the design of the engine was too complicated. He did not have the confidence that he could solve this problem in one go just by relying on the strange schematics in his mind, especially regarding the turbulent flow of electrons. His expression was extremely serious. He carefully drew on the schematics with his digital pen. He was not too excited, because at this time, he finally confirmed that the schematics in his mind seemed to be more advanced than the most advanced designs of the Federation. Uncle Fengyu, how can you be so awesome? You don't know the passage of time when you're watching a game of chess, and you don't know the passage of time in the mountains. This was to say that when a person was fully focused on something, it was easy for problems to arise. When Sulu gently rubbed his reddened eyes and woke up from the endless schematics, he realized that his hunger had reached a terrifying level. He suddenly thought of something, and his expression changed slightly. He packed up everything in the laboratory and rushed out of the research institute as fast as he could. Just as he stepped out of the door, he was stunned to see Zhou Yu.